Silas Blackwood didn't knock. He never did. He walked through the front door of the Sterling ranch house like he owned it because, as far as he was concerned, it was only a matter of time before he did. Boots left mud on the parlor floor. His two men flanked him on either side, thumbs hooked in their belts, eyes moving over everything in the room the way a butcher's eyes move over a hog. Blackwood himself stopped in the center of the room, looked slowly around at the furniture. The walls, mounted longhorn above the fireplace, smiled the way a man smiles when he's counting something that already belongs to him. "Sterling," he said, without looking for Wyatt, without waiting to see if he was even in the room. Clock's ticking. He dropped a folded paper on the table. Didn't hand it, dropped it. 3 weeks, he said. Then I come back with a deed and a sheriff. He walked out the same way he came in. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. The mud on the floor was still wet. If you've ever watched something you built your whole life start to slip through your fingers and felt completely powerless to stop it, then you already understand what this story is about. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your worth could be measured in dollars, stay with me, because this one is for you. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to you, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you never miss what's coming next. Hit the like button if you're already with us, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the cook burned the salt pork, and 3 ranch hands came down with cramps bad enough to keep them in their bunks until Thursday. Wyatt Sterling found both pieces of news within an hour of each other, and neither one improved his mood. Standing in the yard between the main house and the bunkhouse, when his foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Cleet Durbin, brought him the letter with the expression of a man delivering a dead animal to the doorstep. Clet had been with the Sterling Ranch for 11 years. He knew when to talk and when to just hand something over and step back. Stepping back moment. Wyatt took the letter. Looked at the outside first thick paper, good handwriting, postmarked from Billings. Didn't recognize the hand. He didn't get much personal correspondence these days. Most of what came in the post was either from lawyers or from men who wanted something from him, and the line between those two categories had blurred considerably in the past year. Broke the seal and read it standing there in the yard. The smell of burned pork hanging in the air, and 2 of his men arguing somewhere behind the fence about whose fault it was that the smokehouse vents had been blocked for going on 6 weeks. Read the letter twice. Then he folded it very carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and went to find out which of his hands had gotten sick. He didn't say anything about the letter for the rest of the day. Wyatt Sterling was 38 years old and had more money than most men in the Montana Territory would ever see in 3 lifetimes. He had 17,000 acres, a main herd of over 2,000 cattle, 6 outbuildings, a bunkhouse that slept 20, root cellar, a smokehouse that hadn't functioned properly in over a year, and a debt arrangement with Silas Blackwood that had seemed reasonable 18 months ago and had since revealed itself to be something considerably closer to a trap. He was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, quite intelligent, but in the particular way of men who have always had enough resources to solve their problems by force or by payment, which meant he sometimes mistook the size of his wallet for the size of his judgment. His late father had been the same. His mother had told him so, plainly and without unkindness, more than once. His mother had died 8 months ago. He missed her with a steadiness that surprised him, a kind of low-frequency grief that didn't spike or crash, but simply sat in his chest like a stone he'd learned to carry. Eleanor Sterling had been small, practical, occasionally infuriating, and the only person alive who had ever told Wyatt the truth about himself without flinching when he pushed back. He had no idea, while she was alive, how much he'd relied on that. The letter in his pocket was in her handwriting. He'd known that before he finished the first line. He would have known her hand anywhere. She had written it, apparently, some weeks before she died, and arranged for it to be sent upon a particular condition, a condition that had, seemed, now been met. The letter was short. His mother had never been the kind of woman to use 10 words, where 3 would do. "Wyatt," it began, "I have made arrangements with a woman named Mara Bellamy of Billings. She is traveling to the ranch. She believes you have requested her. I know you haven't. I did it because someone needed to, and you wouldn't have. You are going to be angry with me. You are going to feel I overstepped. You are right on both counts. Do something useful with her anyway." Yes, that was the whole letter. His mother had from beyond the grave sent him a bride. Stage from Billings arrived at the junction town of Claro on Wednesday afternoon. Gamara Bellamy stepped off it with a trunk that was significantly heavier than she was, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and the look of a woman who had been in a rattling wooden box for the better part of 2 days and was thoroughly done, pretending it hadn't been miserable. She was not what most people thought of when they thought of a mail-order bride. She was 31 older than many of the women who made such arrangements. She was not beautiful in the arranged, posed way of parlor portraits, but there was a quality to her face that made people keep looking even after they'd decided she wasn't remarkable. She had dark eyes that moved quickly and settled slowly, which meant she looked at things long after most people had moved on to the next thing. Her hands were calloused. Her clothes were good quality but not new. She had with her a letter. Her letter, the one she'd received from what she believed was a ranch owner named Wyatt Sterling, requesting a wife with practical domestic skills and a willingness to work. She'd answered the advertisement 3 months ago and had received, over the following weeks, a series of letters that were thoughtful, specific, and not at all romantic, which had actually increased her confidence in the arrangement rather than diminishing it. The letters had discussed the ranch, the work, the territory, and the winters, and had asked very direct questions about her experience with food preservation and livestock management. She had come because the letters had made her believe this man was serious, that he wanted a partner, not a decoration. She had not come because she was desperate, which was important to her in a way she had difficulty explaining to people who assumed the worst about a woman who agreed to marry a stranger. She had come because the arrangement had seemed honest. She had walked away from a life in Billings that had grown too small, a sister's household where she was useful but not wanted, a town where everyone knew her history, a future that looked the same in every direction she turned. Advertisement had offered something different. She'd taken it. She stood on the boards outside the stage stop in Claro and looked up the road toward the distant shape of a large ranch and thought, not for the first time, that she had made a significant wager on very limited information. Ranch hand arrived 20 minutes later to collect her. Said his name was Tommy. He was 17, and he had clearly been given no other instructions. Drove out to the Sterling Ranch in a wagon, mostly in silence. Gamara spent the time looking at the land around her, which was, she had to admit, extraordinary. Flat and wide and broken by distant blue mountains, the kind of landscape that made a person feel very small and very awake at the same time. She noticed the cattle on the hills. She noticed the fences. She noticed that the east pasture fence had 3 broken posts in a 50-yard stretch. She noticed, when they came up to the ranch yard, that the large building set apart from the others a low, solidly built structure with a heavy door and roofments was dark, and still in a way that suggested it hadn't been used in a while. She filed this away. Wyatt Sterling was waiting in the yard when they pulled in, which meant he'd been waiting for her, which meant he'd decided to face this directly rather than avoiding it, which she took as a reasonable sign. He was taller than she'd expected, not imposing in a theatrical way, but solidly built in the manner of a man who had done real physical work for a long time even after he could afford to stop. His face was weathered, his expression was one she recognized, a man who had decided to be controlled, but hadn't quite achieved it yet. He helped her down from the wagon. He had manners, at least. He did not smile. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Mr. Sterling." Pause. The kind that had a lot of things inside it. "I think," he said carefully, "there may have been some misunderstanding." "You didn't send the letters," she said. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like the recalibration a person does when the conversation goes differently than they planned. "No," he said, "I didn't. Your mother did." Another pause. He reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, his letter, she guessed. He held it but didn't open it. "She died 8 months ago," he said. "She arranged this before she passed." "I'm sorry about your mother," Mara said, and she meant it. Nodded once. He looked at the trunk in the wagon, then back at her. She could see him trying to figure out how to say what he needed to say without being unkind, which she appreciated. "Come a long way," he said finally. "I have." "I don't," he stopped. Started again the arrangement that was described. "I'm not able to." He pressed his mouth into a flat line. "I didn't ask for a wife. I know that now," she said. "You don't want me here. It's not." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not a question of wanting. It's a question of what's honest." And what's honest is that I didn't make this arrangement. I didn't ask for it, and I don't think it would be right for either of us to proceed as if I did." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze, which told her something about him. That's fair, she said. He seemed to expect more resistance. Lack of it made him uncertain, which was interesting to watch. You'll need somewhere to sleep tonight, he said. And a meal. After that, I'd like to speak with you about something I noticed coming into the yard, she said. Blinked. What? That building? She nodded toward the smokehouse. It's not been used in some time. He looked at the smokehouse, then back at her. His expression had shifted into something harder to read. No, he said, it hasn't. Why not? It was a forward question. She knew it and asked it anyway. The man who ran it left, Wyatt said after a moment. Last spring. I haven't found a replacement who knows what they're doing. What kind of operation was it? He studied her. Cured beef, mostly. Some pork. We were selling to buyers in 3 territories. And now? Now we're not. She nodded slowly. She looked at the smokehouse again, then back at him. I'll take that meal, she said. In the bed for tonight. And in the morning, before I figure out what comes next, I'd like to look inside that building. Cleet Durbin, who had spent 11 years watching Wyatt Sterling run this ranch, told his bunkmate that night that the woman who showed up from Billings had a look in her eye that reminded him of the way a horse dealer looks at a horse like she was seeing what it could do before it knew it was being evaluated. Bunkmate, a man of few opinions, said that sounded like trouble. Cleet said he hadn't decided yet. Inside the smokehouse the next morning, Mara decided quickly. It was worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared. The firebox was clogged but intact. The vents were blocked. Birds had nested in 2 of them over the winter, and the accumulated debris had choked the airflow so thoroughly that anyone who'd tried to use it would have ended up with meat that looked smoked but had never properly cured. Hanging racks were sound. The floor drains had been neglected but could be cleared. Salt bins had been left partly open, and the contents had hardened into useless blocks, but that was a matter of $1's worth of replacement salt, not structural damage. She was in there for 40 minutes. Wyatt had followed her in, which told her he was more curious than he wanted to admit. When she came out, she had a list in her head. The vents need clearing, she said. The firebox needs a day's worth of work. The salt bins need to be emptied and refilled. Drains need flushing. Wyatt stood with his arms crossed, watching her. That's not an insignificant amount of work. No. But it's not a new smokehouse either. What's here is functional. Just needs someone to actually look at it. And you're saying you can do that. I'm saying I have before. She looked at him. I worked in my uncle's meatpacking operation for 6 years in Iowa, before I came to Billings. I know how to run a smokehouse. He was quiet. I'm not asking to stay as your wife, she said. I understand that's not what either of us signed up for. I am asking for 30 days. 30 days to do what? To get that smokehouse running. To demonstrate that it can produce what you were selling before and more. If I can do that, I've earned something for my trouble, and you've got a business you lost back in operation. She paused. If I can't, I'll leave. No argument. Wyatt looked past her at the smokehouse. Then at his yard. At the bunkhouse, where 2 of his men were still in their bunks because something in the food supply had made them sick. Something that she now suspected. It had to do with improperly stored or handled meat. The fence line with its broken posts that nobody had gotten around to fixing. At the weight of everything that had been sliding sideways for the past year. 30 days, he said finally. Not a question, 30 days. It was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere behind the bunkhouse, a horse stamped. You'll need help, he said. Some of the men. I'll need whoever you can spare. I won't waste them. He nodded, slowly, with the look of a man who suspected he was making a decision he'd have to live with, but couldn't quite talk himself out of it. There's a room in the main house, he said. Housekeeper's room. Private, and it locks from the inside. That'll do. And Miss Bellamy. He stopped her before she turned back toward the smokehouse. Those 30 days don't come with any assumption about what happens after. I know, she said. That's fine. I'm not asking for assumptions. I'm asking for 30 days. He nodded once. She went back to work. By the end of the first week, 3 things had happened. The smokehouse vents had been cleared. Mara had done most of it herself, with Tommy, the 17-year-old who'd collected her from the stage, acting as her assistant. He was willing and not afraid of heights, which was the relevant qualification, and she'd talked him through it, step by step, with a patience that surprised even her. The firebox had been raked and rebuilt. New salt had been ordered and was coming from town. 2 men who'd gotten sick had recovered, which was the second thing. But in the course of checking the main food stores to figure out what had caused it, Mara had found the problem: a portion of the cured beef from the previous operation's last batch got improperly sealed, stored in a corner of the cellar where temperature fluctuations had compromised the cure. It had looked fine. The smell had been subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking. She'd had it removed and destroyed. The third thing was Silas Blackwood. She hadn't met him yet, but she'd heard about him from Cleet, who mentioned the name in passing while explaining why the ranch hadn't hired a new smokehouse foreman, and then from Tommy, who was less careful about what he said and told her quite directly that Blackwood had loaned Wyatt money 18 months ago against the value of the ranch, that the terms were tight, and that Blackwood stopped by regularly in a way that suggested he was checking on an investment he planned to collect. "Does Mr. Sterling know you're telling me this?" she asked Tommy. "No," Tommy said without any apparent concern. "Then maybe keep it between us for now," she said. She didn't bring any of it up with Wyatt. Not yet. But she started paying attention differently to the account books Wyatt left on his desk, to the letters that came in from Blackwood's office in Helena, to the dates and figures she could see in passing. She wasn't prying. She was building a picture. The picture, when it started to take shape, was not a comfortable one. Wyatt's ranch was not failing because of bad luck or drought or any of the straightforward disasters that could ruin a cattle operation. Failing because of inefficiency, a slow, grinding kind of waste that nobody had noticed or named, because the fortune behind it was large enough to absorb the losses, until suddenly it wasn't. Cattle that should have been generating revenue through cured sales were being sold to commodity buyers at low prices because there was no way to add value on site. Workers who should have been supervised were drifting without clear direction. Operations that should have been managed carefully, like the food supply, like the smokehouse, like the fence lines, had been left to run themselves because there had always been enough money to fix problems after they broke. Now there wasn't, or not as much, because the debt to Blackwood was sitting on top of everything else like a stone slab, and the interest was not small. On the 8th day, she asked Wyatt if she could see the full accounts. Said no. She expected that. She didn't argue. She went back to the smokehouse and worked. On the 12th day, he brought the ledgers to her without explanation and set them on the table and left the room. She understood that this was a significant act and treated it accordingly, meaning she studied everything she needed to and said nothing about it to anyone. What she saw in those accounts cost her 2 nights of sleep. Wyatt Sterling was not a poor man, but the gap between what he had and what Blackwood was owed was narrower than it should have been, and it was narrowing faster than anyone in the house seemed to understand. Cattle operation was generating money, but not enough. Not anymore. The commodity prices had softened. Costs of keeping the operation running had not. And the debt's interest was compounding in a way that made Mara's jaw tighten when she ran the numbers twice and got the same answer both times. He could still save this, but only if he stopped losing. She started making a different kind of list. Not materials for the smokehouse, though that list was ongoing too. This was a list of waste places where money was going out without anything coming back in. Spoiled meat, poor storage, cheap buyers who weren't being replaced with better ones because no one had the time or knowledge to pursue them. Workers who were skilled but misassigned, doing jobs they were average at when there were jobs they'd be excellent at sitting undone. She didn't bring it to Wyatt as a lecture. She started making small changes within her authority and left evidence of the savings in places he'd notice. The first week of smokehouse operations produced a modest batch of cured beef, not enough to change anything, but enough to show the method worked. She had Cleet move 2 of the stronger hands to fence repair on the east pasture. Wyatt noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. On the 14th day, Blackwood came to visit. Mara was in the smokehouse when the fancy carriage came into the yard. She saw it through the gap in the smokehouse door and knew without being told who it was. Stayed where she was. She watched. Blackwood was a compact, well-dressed man in his mid-50s, the kind of man who was always slightly too clean for wherever he was standing. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had made a great deal of money by identifying weakness in other people and converting it. He shook Wyatt's hand. He looked around the yard. His eyes stopped on the smokehouse, which now had visible smoke rising from the vents for the first time in over a year. She saw his expression change, just slightly, a small tightening around the eyes. Then he looked past the smokehouse and found her. She hadn't moved from the gap, hadn't tried to hide, and they looked at each other across the yard for 2 or 3 seconds without any expression at all. Then he looked back at Wyatt and his face rearranged into a pleasantry. She went back to work. That night, Cleet found her on the porch after supper and told her, quietly, that Blackwood had spent 20 minutes inside with Wyatt and that he'd seemed less satisfied leaving than he did arriving. "What did they talk about?" she asked. "Don't know," Cleet said. "Blackwood asked about you. Asked who you were and why you were here." "What did Mr. Sterling tell him?" Cleet was quiet for a moment. "Told him you were family," he said. She thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. At the end of the second week, she had the Smokehouse producing at a rate she was satisfied with. Not perfect. The first batch had been good but not exceptional. She'd been conservative with the seasoning until she understood how the firebox ran. Second batch was better. She had 3 of the ranch hands rotating through the process now, learning it, and Tommy had turned out to have a natural instinct for fire management that she hadn't expected and had immediately put to use. She also had a problem. One of the batches, the third, which she'd considered her best yet, had been lost. Not burned, not ruined by error, but wrong. Spoiled in a way she could not account for by looking at her own process, because her own process had been correct. Stood over the ruined meat and went through everything twice and came up with nothing. Everything she'd done had been right. The salt, the temperature, timing, the hang all correct. She called Tommy in. She asked him to walk her through the last 3 days in the Smokehouse, every person who'd been in, every time the door had opened. Tommy went through it. At the end he said, "Well," then that one fella came by from the south pasture. Said he had a message for Cleet. He came in to ask if I'd seen him. "Who was that?" "Don't know him well. He came on a few months back. Works the south pasture mostly." Tommy paused. "He came through while I was outside at the water pump." She didn't say what she was thinking. She said, "Thank you, Tommy," and sent him back to his work. She stood there alone in the Smokehouse for a while. Then she went to find Cleet. She didn't ask him directly about the man from the south pasture. Instead, she asked Cleet to tell her, casually, how the south pasture crew had been put together, who'd hired them, when, whether there'd been anyone new in the past few months. Cleet told her, including that one of the men had been recommended by a contact in Helena, where Blackwood's offices were. She went back to the Smokehouse and stood there for a long moment, looking at what had been ruined. She made a decision. She wasn't going to go to Wyatt with suspicion and a theory. She was going to build something that couldn't be sabotaged by one man, because one person's interference wouldn't be enough to stop it. She was going to teach every single person on this ranch how to do what she did. Next morning, she stood in the yard before first light and asked Cleet to get her every man who could be spared from immediate work. She looked at the crew when they'd assembled tired faces, confused faces, a couple of resentful ones. She was a woman who'd arrived less than 3 weeks ago, was not the boss's wife, and was asking for their time before breakfast. She said, "I'm going to teach you everything I know about curing meat. Every one of you. By the time I'm done, none of you will need me." That's exactly the point. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Cleet, who had not been told to be there but had come anyway, nodded once from the back of the group. Then they got to work. The crew didn't take to it immediately. That would have been the version of this story where everything goes smoothly, and nothing about those weeks was smooth. First morning, she stood in front of them. Mara could read the room well enough to know she had maybe 3 men who were genuinely interested, 4 who were waiting to see what happened before they decided, and the rest who were present in body only, thinking about breakfast and whether this was going to be cut into their regular work in a way that would make Cleet come after them later. One man, a lean, sun-darkened hand named Purdy, who'd been on the ranch for 7 years, and considered himself something of an authority on things, crossed his arms about 30 seconds into her explanation of salt ratios, and didn't uncross them for the rest of the morning. She taught anyway. She'd learned, in the years she'd spent in her uncle's operation in Iowa, that the best way to teach a skeptical man was not to argue with his skepticism, but to make the work interesting enough that he forgot to maintain it. She started with the simplest things, not because the men were simple, but because simple was where the real mistakes happened. Because men who understood the foundation of something would improvise correctly when they had to, while men who'd only learned rules would freeze when the rules ran out. Salt, she told them, was not about flavor. That was the mistake people made. Salt was about drawing moisture from the meat faster than bacteria could multiply, creating an environment where nothing dangerous could survive long enough to take hold. The moment you understood that, you understood why temperature mattered, why the thickness of the cut mattered, why the drying time before smoking wasn't optional. It wasn't tradition. It was a physical process, and once you knew the process, you couldn't unknow it. Purdy uncrossed his arms around mid-morning, which she's noticed but didn't remark on. Tommy, who'd already been her closest apprentice, proved to be useful in a different way during these group sessions. He asked exactly the questions that the older men were too proud to ask, which meant she could answer them without anyone having to admit they didn't know. She was grateful for this and told him so that evening, privately, which made him go red to the ears and stare at his boots. By the end of the third day of teaching, she had a working crew who understood the basics well enough to run in the smokehouse without her holding their hands at every stage. 3. By the end of the first week of combined production and training, the ranch had produced more cured beef than it had in the previous 6 months combined. This was the point at which Wyatt Sterling stopped, pretending he wasn't paying attention. He came to the smokehouse on a Thursday evening. After the day's work was done, and the last of the hanging racks had been checked, Gonti stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at what was there: the organized stores. Clean floor drains, the orderly rows of curing cuts at various stages, the handwritten process chart she'd nailed to the wall near the firebox, and he was quiet for a long time. "How much is this worth?" he said finally. "Not quite a question." "Right now? Or when I'm done, both?" she told him. Current batch, sold at reasonable market rate, rather than the low prices the ranch had been accepting from commodity buyers, would recover a significant portion of what the operation had lost over the past year. But that wasn't the important number. The important number was what a functioning smokehouse operation, producing consistently and selling to premium buyers rather than middlemen, could add to the ranch's revenue on an annual basis. She told him that number too. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "How do you know what buyers are paying?" "I wrote to 4 of them," she said, "before I came out here. When I was still in Billings and reading those letters your mother wrote." She paused. "I wanted to know if there was a market before I agreed to come." Something shifted in his face. He looked at the process chart on the wall, then back at her. "You researched this before you got on the stage." "I always research before I make a decision." He was quiet again. This was a quality she'd come to recognize in him. He went quiet when he was processing something that changed his picture of a situation, and he stayed quiet until the picture had settled. She'd learned not to fill the silence. "My mother knew you'd written to the buyers," he said finally. "I assume she knew enough about me to guess I would." Nodded slowly. He turned his hat over in his hands once, then put it back on. "There's something you should know," he said. She waited. "Blackwood's debt arrangement." The terms. He stopped. Pressed his mouth flat. He didn't like saying this. She could see the effort it cost him, because he was a man who'd spent his whole life solving his own problems, and admitting to a bad decision was not something his pride accommodated easily. Clause. "If I miss any payment, any single payment, even a partial one, he has the right to claim not just the land but any commercial enterprise operating on it." She felt the bottom of her stomach drop, but she kept her face still. "Any enterprise," she repeated. "The smokehouse, if it's generating revenue when he calls the debt, he can take it." She looked at the smokehouse around her, at what they'd built in 3 weeks. The hanging racks, the process charts, the orderly store of salt and wood, and carefully managed meat. "When's the next payment due?" she asked. 41 days. She thought about this carefully. "And can you make it?" He was quiet long enough that she knew the answer before he said it. "Not the full amount. Not without the smokehouse income." "Then we need the smokehouse income." "That's what I'm saying, Miss Bellamy." "How much time do we have to generate it?" "If we sell to buyers at the prices you mentioned, real prices, not commodity prices, and if we can do it in the next 5 weeks," he stopped. "Maybe. If nothing goes wrong." She heard the if. He heard her hear it. And something passed between them in the silence, a mutual understanding of how many things could go wrong, and how little room there was for any of them. "I'll need to contact those buyers directly," she said. "Not through any middlemen Blackwood might know." He looked at her sharply. "What do you know about his middlemen?" "Nothing specific. But men like Blackwood don't invest money without watching where it goes. If he has contacts in the commodity buyer network, and he likely does, then any offer we run through that network could get back to him before we've closed the deal." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying that's certain. I'm saying I wouldn't risk it." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since I looked at your accounts," she said. "Since the ruined batch." Expression shifted. "Tell me about that." So she did. She told him what she'd found, what Tommy had said, what she'd asked Cleet about the South Pasture crew, and what Cleet had told her. She didn't dramatize it. She laid it out the same way she'd laid out the smokehouse repairs. Here's what I found. Here's what it means. Here's what I think we should do about it. When she finished, Wyatt's expression had gone to something flat and controlled that was more alarming than anger would have been. "Man from Helena," he said. "I don't know it for certain," she said. "But I know what I know. I'll talk to Cleet carefully," she said. "If you move on it too fast and he has a way to get word out, Blackwood will know we're watching." Wyatt looked at her steadily. "How long have you been managing situations like this?" "I haven't," she said honestly. "But I've watched men lose things they built because they moved too fast when they found out they'd been cheated. Anger makes you visible. Patience makes you dangerous." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "Where'd you learn that?" "My uncle lost his whole operation in Iowa because he went straight at the man who'd been skimming from him, and the man had friends with lawyers, and my uncle didn't." She paused. "Took him 6 years to build back from nothing. I was there for all 6 of them." This was more personal information than she'd given him in the entire 3 weeks she'd been on the ranch, and she watched him absorb it not with the false sympathy people sometimes offered, but with the attentive quality of a man who was updating his understanding of who he was talking to. "I'm sorry," he said, plain and direct, the way she'd noticed he said most things. "So am I," she said, "but it taught me something worth knowing." Stood in the smokehouse together for another moment. Outside, the night was coming in quietly, the way Montana nights did without drama, just a long, slow dimming until the stars arrived. "Go right to the buyers tomorrow," she said. "Under my name, not yours. Just to start. Why your name? Because if Blackwood is watching the ranch's correspondence, he might not be watching mine yet." She paused. "Doesn't know who I am. Not really." Wyatt considered this. "He will soon enough." "I know," she said. "So we'd better be fast." She wrote 4 letters that night by lamplight, sitting at the small desk in the housekeeper's room with the door locked and the window cracked for the cool air. She wrote to Byers and Bozeman, Missoula, and 2 in the Billings territory. Men whose names she'd collected during her research months ago, men who had reputations for paying fair prices and honoring contracts. She told them who she was, where she was writing from, described the quality of what was being produced, and named a price she'd calculated carefully enough below premium to look like a real offer, enough above commodity to make the ranch's numbers work. She sealed the letters and put them in her canvas bag to post in town, personally the next morning. Then she sat for a while in the quiet of the small room, listening to the ranch settle into night around her, and let herself feel, just briefly, how precarious all of this was. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because she was honest enough with herself not to pretend the stakes weren't real. She had come here for 30 days. She was on day 22, and she had turned a dead operation into a functioning one, identified what she believed was sabotage, begun teaching a crew of skeptical men a skill they now actually wanted to learn, started a correspondence with outside buyers that might make the difference between Wyatt Sterling keeping his ranch and losing it to a man who'd built his fortune on other people's disasters. She had not come here to do any of that. She had come because her life had grown too small, and a letter had offered something different. She thought about what Wyatt had told Blackwood, that she was family. She blew out the lamp and went to sleep. Letters came back fast, faster than she'd expected. First response arrived 8 days later, from the buyer in Bozeman, a man named H. Bill Garrett, who ran supply contracts for 3 hotel dining rooms, and had apparently been looking for a consistent source of quality cured beef for the better part of 2 years. His letter was short, direct, and contained a number that made Mara read the line twice before she let herself believe it. Wanted a standing contract, not a one-time purchase. Monthly delivery, consistent quality, and a price per pound that was 20% above what she'd proposed. Sat on the porch and read the letter 4 times. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the north pasture looking at a section of fence line that had been repaired. She'd had Cleet reassign 2 men to it 10 days ago, which Wyatt hadn't objected to, just watched, and he turned when he heard her coming, read her expression before she said a word, and came to meet her halfway. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it. His face didn't change much, but his eyes moved through the lines twice, which was his version of the same thing she'd done. Standing contract, he said. Monthly delivery. He's got 3 dining establishments, and he said she paused because this next part still struck her. He said he's been telling his suppliers for 2 years that whoever could give him consistent quality at fair price would have his business for as long as he ran those rooms. Wyatt looked up from the letter. How long has he been running them? 14 years. He was quiet. He looked at the letter again. Then he folded it carefully and held it. This is enough to cover the payment, he said. Not to her specifically. Working through numbers in his head. This alone. But this in Missoula, if that letter comes back positive, yes. With enough left that we're not starting the next month at zero. Looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. The look of a man who'd carried something heavy for a long time and had just had some of it taken from him unexpectedly and wasn't quite sure how to stand without it. You wrote those letters from your own name, he said.
Yes.
Without knowing if they'd respond. Without knowing if it would work. It was a reasonable bet, she said. Most people wouldn't have taken it. Not for someone else's problem. She looked at him steadily. I know the difference between someone else's problem and a problem I'm standing in the middle of, she said. This one stopped being yours alone about 3 weeks ago. Didn't say anything to that, but he didn't look away either. She left him with the letter and went back to the Smokehouse. 3 days later, the responses from Missoula and the first Billings buyer arrived on the same afternoon, and both were favorable. Not as favorable as Garrett's one was a one-time purchase offer at good rates. The other was a trial contract pending quality review, but together with Bozeman, the numbers were starting to come together in a way that looked less like hope and more like arithmetic. Gamara spread the letters across the table in the main house and did the calculation 3 times. Each time she got the same answer. If nothing went wrong in the next 22 days, they could cover the payment, possibly with something left. The problem was the qualification she'd had to keep adding, every time she thought about the timeline, if nothing went wrong. Because things had already gone wrong once, in a way she couldn't prove, but was fairly sure she understood. And the man she was fairly sure was responsible was still on the ranch, still working the south pasture, still going about his business like nothing had happened. Cleet had identified him quietly, after a careful conversation with Wyatt, exactly as she'd suggested, but they hadn't moved on him. They'd decided to watch him, to let him think the sabotaged batch had been dismissed as a fluke, to see what he did next. What he did next was nothing for 12 days. On the 13th day, he tried again. This time it was not the meat itself. This time it was the firebox, a wad of wet clay packed into the secondary flue, which would have been unnoticeable unless you were doing a thorough inspection before a major production run. It would have choked the airflow, caused the temperature to drop inconsistently, and produced a batch of meat that looked correct but wasn't smoked on the outside, inadequately cured within. Kind of thing that wouldn't be caught until after delivery. Kind of thing that could destroy the contract she'd spent weeks building. Tommy found it. He'd gotten into the habit, in the past 10 days, checking the flue as part of his morning routine without being asked because he'd internalized the principle well enough to understand that airflow problems showed up in the firebox first. And because he was 17 and took his new expertise seriously in the way that 17-year-olds sometimes did, with a completeness that older people often abandoned. Came to get her without saying anything to anyone else, and they stood together in the Smokehouse and looked at the clay, and she felt something cold move through her that wasn't anger, but was the thing that came before anger. Don't touch it, she said. Leave it exactly where it is. We going to tell Mr. Sterling? Yes, she said. Go find Cleet first. Don't run. She waited in the Smokehouse until they both came, and then she showed them. Cleet looked at it for a long time. He asked Tommy when he'd last checked the flue, and Tommy told him, and they worked out that it had been placed there sometime in the previous 12 hours, most likely before dawn. Cleet's expression was one of a man controlling something with considerable effort. Billings' contract review is in 8 days, Mara said quietly. Bozeman first delivery is in 12. I know, Cleet said. Clay had stayed, I know what it would have done. He looked at her. Do you want to go to Mr. Sterling, or do you want me to? Both of us, she said. Now, Wyatt's reaction, when they told him, was the flat, controlled expression she'd seen once before, only this time there was something underneath it that she could see pressing against the surface. Sat at the table in the main house, with his hands flat on the wood, and listened to all of it without speaking. When Cleet finished, Wyatt said, Where is he now? South pasture, Cleet said. Is he likely to run? Not if he thinks we don't know. He's careful. He's been careful. Cleet glanced at Mara. Both times. Wyatt looked at his hands, then at Mara. What do you want to do? She hadn't expected to be asked. She thought about it for a moment, not about what felt satisfying, but about what would actually work. Keep the clay in the flue for now, she said, Don't touch it. Don't move it. Let him think it's still there, and we haven't found it." Wyatt frowned. "Why? Because if we take him now, we have a man who was putting clay in a pipe. That's not nothing, but it's not enough to get to Blackwood. But if we leave things as they are, if he reports back to whoever's directing him that the sabotage is in place, they may move in a way that shows their hand more clearly." Cleet made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite objection. "In the smokehouse?" Wyatt asked. "I'll run the production from a different setup. There's the secondary firebox at the east end. It hasn't been used in a while, but it's sound. Checked it last week." She paused. He may not even know it exists. Wyatt looked at her for a long, measured moment. "You checked the secondary firebox last week." "I check everything periodically," she said. "It's easier to know what you have before you need it." He held her gaze. Then he exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it. "All right," he said, "we do it your way." The next 2 days were strange. Ran the smokehouse from the east firebox, producing what they needed while the sabotaged primary flue sat untouched. Man from the south pasture went about his work. Nobody told him anything was different. The clay sat in the flue like evidence, waiting. On the morning of the 3rd day, he saddled a horse and rode to the far edge of the south pasture and spent 40 minutes there, which was 20 minutes longer than any part of fence work required. When he came back, he had the look of a man who'd delivered something and was now waiting for results. Clet had a man in the south pasture who'd watched the whole thing. Ryder, who'd met him, a man on a dark horse, coming from the direction of the Helena Road, was identified 2 days later. He was a known associate of Silas Blackwood's freight operation. That was the piece they'd needed. On the day the Billings buyer was due to arrive for his quality review, Mara was in the smokehouse before sunrise. She had not slept well. Not because she was afraid of the review. The product was as good as anything she'd ever produced, and she'd do it with the particular confidence of someone who'd been doing this long enough to trust her own judgment without needing it confirmed. She hadn't slept well because she was doing arithmetic again, kind that didn't involve salt ratios or curing times, but instead involved the number of days remaining, number of things that still needed to go right, and the number of ways this could still come apart. 22 days to payment. She got up before the arithmetic could get any louder and went to the smokehouse and built the fire in the east firebox and stayed with the work until the light came up and the rest of the ranch started moving around her. Tommy arrived at the smokehouse at his usual time and found her there and didn't say anything about it being early. He just picked up his tasks from where they'd been left the night before and got on with them, which was the best thing about Tommy. He understood when work was the answer to what was wrong. Billings' buyer arrived mid-morning. His name was Vernon Chast, a practical man in his late 40s who'd been sourcing meat supplies for the northern Montana hotel circuit for 12 years, and who had, over those 12 years, seen every variety of overpromised, underdelivered product that the territory could produce. Came in with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who expected to be disappointed and had made peace with it. Mara met him at the smokehouse door. She didn't give him a speech. She cut him a sample, handed it to him, and waited. Tasted it. Said nothing for a moment. Turned it over with his tongue, the way someone does when they're actually evaluating something rather than being polite. "Who smoked this?" he said. "I did," she said, "with the crew." "How long cured?" she told him. He nodded, still chewing. "What wood?" "Apple and hickory, split even. Some cherry in the last stage." Looked at her properly for the first time. "That's not a common combination." "No," she said, "but it works for this cut. The cherry pulls some of the fat forward without overpowering the beef flavor. It's quiet." He looked at the smokehouse, the organized racks, the process charts on the wall, the clean operation. "You the one who wrote the letter," he said. "Yes." "Sterling's wife?" "I run the smokehouse," she said. Clear and even. He studied her for another moment. Then he said, "I want to see the full batch." She showed him. He left 2 hours later with a signed contract and a handshake, and Mara watched his wagon roll out of the yard and let herself breathe. Just once, all the way down. Then she went back inside. Wyatt was standing at the edge of the yard when she came out. He'd watched the whole exchange from a distance. She'd been aware of him there without turning around. "Signed," she said as she passed. "I saw." He fell into step beside her without asking. They walked toward the house. He was in there for 2 hours. He wanted to see everything, and she glanced over at him. He signed. He was quiet for a few steps. "You didn't call for me once." "You weren't needed." The words came out before she'd shaped them, and she heard how they sounded not unkind, but blunt in a way that could sting. Stopped walking. I didn't mean it like that, she said. How did you mean it? She turned to face him properly. I meant that the product speaks for itself, and the person who made it was standing right there. You're the owner that's important, but it's a different kind of important. She paused. He needed to know the smokehouse was real, not that the ranch had money behind it. Gah! He looked at her for a moment. There were lines around his eyes she hadn't paid attention to before, the kind that came from years of squinting into the sun and from years of carrying things without saying so. My father, he said slowly, used to say that the problem with having money is that you eventually forget what the money was for. She waited. He meant it as a cautionary tale, Wyatt said. I thought I understood what he meant. I'm not sure I did, until recently. She didn't fill in what he left unsaid. She'd learned by now to let him get there himself. Buyer didn't care about the Sterling name, Wyatt said. Cared about the meat. Yes. Wyatt looked toward the smokehouse. Then back at her. And the meat is real because you made it real. She held his gaze and didn't look away. We made it real, she said. Every one of those men in there who learned how to do this, they made it real too. The whole point. That's why it'll hold even after she stopped. After I leave. That's what she'd been about to say. Again, he heard the stop. Ah. He looked at her and said nothing, and she looked at him and said nothing. And between them was the thing that had been building for 20-some days of working alongside each other in a way that neither of them had planned for or prepared for. Then he said, the Bozeman delivery is in 9 days. I know, she said. After that, we'll know whether the numbers work. Yes. He nodded. He started back toward the house. After a few steps, he stopped without turning around. Miss Bellamy. Thank you. She watched him go. Then she went to check on the east firebox, because the fire still needed tending, and because work was always where she found solid ground when the rest of it felt like it was shifting under her feet. Clay was still in the primary flue. The evidence was still there. Somewhere on the south pasture, a man was waiting for instructions from a man in Helena who had not yet understood that he had already run out of easy moves. That understanding, she knew, was coming, and when it did, things would get considerably worse before they got better. Bozeman delivery went out on a Wednesday, which was 9 days after Vernon Chast signed his contract and drove away from the Sterling ranch with the look of a man who'd found something he hadn't expected to find. Wyatt arranged the wagon himself. He didn't usually involve himself in logistics at that level. He had Cleet for that. And before Cleet, there had been managers who handled such things, but he was in the yard at 4 a.m. when the loading started. And he stayed until the wagon rolled out through the gate with Tommy riding alongside as second man, which had been Mara's request and Wyatt's agreement without discussion. She'd sent Tommy because she trusted his judgment with the product, and because she wanted someone on that wagon who would not accept a lowball renegotiation at the point of delivery, which was a thing buyers sometimes attempted when they thought the seller was desperate. Tommy was 17 and looked it, which meant buyers sometimes made that mistake with him. And Tommy had the quality of a person who did not adjust his position based on what the other person expected of him. She'd told him what the contract said, what the delivery weight should be, got what the price was, come home with a signed receipt and the agreed sum and nothing less. He'd nodded with the seriousness of someone being given important work, which he was. Nah. She watched the wagon go from the smokehouse doorway and then went back to the east firebox, because standing and watching things leave was not useful, and because the next batch was already in process and needed attention. Wyatt came to find her an hour later. He didn't say anything immediately. He'd developed a habit, in the past weeks, of arriving at the smokehouse and standing just inside the door for a moment before speaking, which she'd come to understand as his version of adjusting from whatever he'd been doing before to the particular frequency of this place and the work happening in it. She didn't rush him. Cleet moved on the south pasture man this morning, he said. She looked up from the firebox before the wagon left. Quietly, he paused. He's gone. Gone where? Cleet let him leave. Told him he was no longer needed on the ranch and that he should collect his things and go before the sun came up. Considered this. You let him go. We have the identification of the rider he met. We have Cleet's man as a witness. We have the clay in the flue. Wyatt leaned against the doorframe. What we don't have is a clear line from that clay to Blackwad that a lawyer couldn't argue around in 5 minutes. Keeping him here just puts him on guard. And letting him go means he goes back to Blackwood, she said. Tells him the sabotage is still in place and the operation is running fine, Wyatt said. Which is what he believes, because that's what we showed him. She understood. So Blackwood thinks the delivery going out this morning is going to fail. That's what his man told him, or will tell him when he gets to wherever he's going. She looked at the firebox, thought about this, and when the delivery doesn't fail, she said, then Blackwood will try something else, Wyatt said. Something bigger. Because he's the kind of man who escalates when a strategy doesn't work, rather than reconsidering it. You know him well. I've known men like him my whole life. He said it without bitterness, just as a plain fact. My father had dealings with two of them, men who build fortune on the misfortune of others and call it business. She nodded slowly. So we're waiting for him to move, she said. We're ready for him to move, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him across the smokehouse. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not braced, just present, in a way that was different from how he'd stood in that first conversation in the yard 30-something days ago. Something had shifted in him that she didn't quite have language for. He still wasn't easy to know. But the guardedness that had been there at the start, the particular armor of a man who'd learned to solve everything with money or with silence, had developed gaps. "You haven't slept," she said. He blinked. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you haven't slept." Pause. He looked at the floor briefly. 4 hours, maybe. Go sleep. Tommy won't be back until this evening, and there's nothing that requires you to be awake until then. He looked like he was going to object, and then the objection didn't quite make it to words, which was its own kind of answer. "Accounts," he started. "Will be the same whether you look at them now or in 4 hours," she said. "Go," he went, which surprised her a little. She turned back to the firebox and worked alone in the quiet of the smokehouse, and somewhere in the process of checking the cuts and adjusting the airflow and writing the morning notes into her record book, thought about what it meant, that she'd just told a man worth 17,000 acres to go to bed and he'd done it. She didn't think about it for too long. There was work to do. Tommy came back that evening with a signed receipt, the agreed sum, and a handshake from H. Bell Garrett that he described as real firm, like he meant it, which made Mara smile in spite of herself. He also brought back something she hadn't asked for, an unsolicited letter from Garrett, addressed to her, written in a neat commercial hand on hotel stationery. She read it at the kitchen table with Wyatt sitting across from her and Cleet standing in the doorway. Garrett had written to say that he had, since receiving the first delivery, mentioned the source to two of his colleagues in the Bozeman Supply Circle who ran similar operations in the eastern districts. Both had expressed interest in establishing their own arrangements. He had taken the liberty of giving them her name and the ranch address. Hoped this was acceptable. He had also written, in the final line, that the beef was the finest he'd sourced in 6 years of looking. She set the letter down on the table. Wyatt picked it up and read it. Set it down again. He looked at her. He sent referrals, he said. Yes. Without being asked. Yes. Wyatt sat back in his chair. Something on his face she'd seen only once or twice before, not the controlled look, not the quiet processing look, but something that was almost unguarded. A man who had just understood something that changed the size of a situation. "If those two buyers contact us," he said slowly, "and if they're running operations at the scale Garrett's running, then the payment to Blackwood isn't the question anymore," she said. "Question becomes what we do after." Cleet, from the doorway, made a sound that in another context might have been a laugh. Wyatt looked at the letter one more time. Then he looked at Mara. "My mother," he said, "was a very perceptive woman." "She was," Mara said. He looked away out the dark window. Nodded, once to himself. Tommy, who had been eating a biscuit throughout this entire exchange, said, "So we did good?" "Tommy," Cleet said, "you did good." Rumor started 4 days later. Mara heard it first from a rancher named Delwood, who ran a modest spread to the east and occasionally sent his wife to trade preserves and cured goods with the Sterling kitchen. His wife, Ada, came by on a Thursday morning and found Mara in the yard and said, in the apologetic way of someone delivering news they haven't verified but feel obligated to pass along, that she'd heard talk in town. Talk that Sterling beef had made people sick. Mara stood very still. "Where did you hear this?" she asked. Ada named the feed store, the post office exchange, and a woman who worked in the dry goods shop near the stage stop. 3 separate conversations, all in the past 2 days, all saying the same thing, that people who'd eaten cured beef from the Sterling ranch had come down ill. Mara thanked her, didn't show what she felt, waited until Ada's wagon had rolled back down the road, and then went directly to Wyatt. He was already in the house. Cleet was with him. From the look on both of their faces, they'd heard something too. "How many places?" she asked. 3 that Cleet found this morning, Wyatt said. Jaw was tight. Blackwood's people have been talking to supply buyers in at least 2 towns, telling them the first Bozeman delivery made hotel guests ill. That's not possible, she said. That product was. I know, Wyatt said. I know it's not true. That's not the point. She understood. Truth wasn't the point. Speed was the point. Blackwood had figured out that the delivery had succeeded the sabotaged flu. The product, all of it had not worked, and this was what he'd moved to next. Exactly as Wyatt had predicted. Bigger, faster. She sat down at the table, which was unusual for her. She rarely sat when she could stand and pressed her hands flat on the wood and thought. Garrett, she said. We need to get to Garrett before this reaches him through someone else. I've already written to him, Wyatt said. I'll write too. From me, she looked up. He needs to hear it in my voice, not yours. Made the contract with me. Wyatt nodded, and the other buyers. Chast, the Missoula man, the pending inquiry from Garrett's referrals. She was thinking as she talked, which meant the thoughts were coming faster than she could organize them, and she let them come. Can't fight this by denying it. Denying a rumor just keeps the rumor alive. We need to make the rumor irrelevant. Cleet said, How do you make something like that irrelevant? She looked at him. Witnesses. Real ones. People who've eaten the product and are standing in front of you looking healthy. She paused. Garrett's hotel guests. Ada's family, has she been using our beef? She bought 2 cuts last month, Cleet said, from the first batch. Get me Ada, she said. And anyone else in this county who's eaten Sterling beef in the past 30 days and can say so in front of another person. Going to put them in front of the buyers, Wyatt said. I'm going to put them in front of whoever's listening to Blackwood's story and hasn't made up their mind yet. She looked at Wyatt. People who've already decided to believe it, we can't move them. But there are people in the middle, people who heard the rumor and are waiting to see what comes next. Those are the ones we can reach. Wyatt was quiet. He was doing the thing he did, processing, settling. Then he said, There's a buyer from the billing circuit coming through Claro next week. Name of Driscoll. He's been hearing about the ranch, probably including this. When Wednesday? 5 days. She thought about what she could gather in 5 days. I'll need a list of everyone who's purchased from us or received product from us since the Smokehouse started running, she said. Every name. I can get that, Cleet said. And I'll need someone to ride to Bozeman to Garrett's hotel and come back with written statements from his staff, not the guests, the staff. They would know within 24 hours if anyone had complained about the food. Wyatt said, I'll go to Bozeman myself. She looked at him. Carries more weight if I go, he said. The owner, not a hand. She didn't argue. He was right. Go tomorrow, she said. Come back by Monday. He nodded. He was already thinking about the ride. She could see it, the logistical shift happening in his expression. Then he focused back on her. What are you going to do while I'm gone? He asked. Work, she said. Keep the smokehouse running. Keep the crew working. She paused. Keep Blackwood's man out of this operation. Cleet said quietly. Man's gone. Miss Bellamy. We sent him off. That man is gone, she said. I don't know if he's the only one. Room went quiet with that. She hadn't meant to say it that plainly. But it was what she'd been thinking since the South Pasture man had been let go, that one person placed on a ranch this large was useful but limited, and a man like Blackwood would understand that and might have planned for redundancy. You think there's another one, Wyatt said. I think there might be, she said. I don't know who. I've been watching, but I don't know. Looked at Cleet. Cleet looked at the wall and thought. I'll be careful, Wyatt said finally, while I'm gone. You don't need to be careful in Bozeman, she said. You need me to be careful here. He looked at her for a moment. Can you do that? Run it and watch it at the same time. She thought about her uncle's operation in Iowa, about the 6 years she'd spent there learning the difference between a business that could survive a bad day and one that couldn't. About her uncle's face in the year after he lost it all, standing in someone else's facility, doing someone else's work with a careful blankness that had taken her a long time to understand was shame. Yes, she said, Wyatt left before dawn on Friday. She heard his horse go and lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the ranch settle back into quiet, and then she got up and went to the smokehouse. She ran a tighter operation in those 3 days than she had at any point since arriving. Not louder or more visible tighter, in a sense of closer attention to who was where, who was handling what, who had access to which parts of the process. She kept the records locked in the housekeeper's room at night. She moved the day's production notes out of the smokehouse at the end of each shift rather than leaving them on the wall. She also quietly began watching. Not obviously. Not in a way that created tension or made anyone feel accused. She simply paid attention to the patterns of movement around the smokehouse, to who came in when, to whether anyone showed interest in the operation that wasn't connected to their assigned work. On Saturday, she noticed it. A man named Reeves, who worked the cattle on the North Range and had no particular business near the smokehouse, came by twice in a single afternoon, once in the early hours, asking Tommy something about water access that Tommy handled in 2 sentences, and once later, when Tommy was at supper and only Mara was inside. He stood at the open door and looked in and said he'd been wondering about the smell, that he'd always been curious about curing, that he'd worked in a smoked operation once, down in Colorado. She talked to him for a few minutes, answered questions. Let him look. After he left, she stood at the firebox and thought about it carefully. She couldn't be sure. He might genuinely have been curious. Curiosity was not evidence of anything. But she moved 2 of the critical production notes to a different location and told nobody, and changed the timing of her morning inspection routine without explanation. On Sunday, Reeves didn't come back. On Monday morning, she found a scrape on the outside latch of the smokehouse door that hadn't been there on Friday. Fresh metal on old iron, someone had worked the latch with a tool in the night, and whoever it was had been careful but not careful enough. Stood and looked at the scrape for a long time. Then she went inside. Nothing had been touched. Got whatever Reeves, or whoever had done it, had been looking for the production notes, recipe records, something they could bring to Blackwood to demonstrate the operation. Was vulnerable they hadn't found it, because she'd moved everything. She locked the smokehouse from the inside and sat on the floor with her back against the firebox and put her face in her hands. Not because she was defeated, but because she needed 1 minute, just one, to feel how tired she was before she stood back up and kept going. She gave herself the minute. Then she got up and started the fire for the day. Wyatt came back Monday evening with a leather satchel and a look that meant he'd gotten what he went for. He found her at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, going over the week's production records. Sat across from her and opened the satchel and put 5 written statements on the table, each signed, each from a member of Garrett's hotel staff, the kitchen supervisor, 2 servers, a head of housekeeping who'd been eating kitchen staff meals for 11 years, and a sous chef who'd worked in 3 territories and had opinions about smoked beef that ran to nearly half a page. None of the hotel guests, not one, had reported illness. Staff who ate the product daily were all accounted for and healthy. Kitchen supervisor had added a personal note saying that Garrett's dining room had seen a noticeable increase in repeat bookings since the beef had changed, and that was not something that happened when people were getting sick. She read through all 5 and set them down. This is enough to move the Driscoll meeting, she said. Yes, he said. And there's something else. He pulled a final piece of paper from the satchel. Not a signed statement, a letter, written on the stationery of a supply firm in Bozeman. One of Garrett referrals had reached out on their own. A buyer named Prescott, who ran supply contracts for a mining camp operation and 2 hotel chains in the Northeast Territory. He'd heard the rumors about Sterling beef. He'd also heard, through Garrett's network, that the rumors weren't holding up when you looked at them directly. He wanted to meet. He's coming through the territory in 3 weeks, Wyatt said. 3 weeks. 12 days after the Blackwood payment deadline. She did the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head. For so many nights it had started to happen automatically, like breathing. If they closed the Driscoll sale, if the Missoula arrangement held, nothing else went wrong between now and the deadline. We're close, she said. How close? She picked up her production ledger, turned to the page where she'd been running her estimates, and slid it across the table. Looked at the numbers. For a long time. When he looked up, his expression had the quality she'd learned to recognize as controlled feeling, not the armor he'd worn at the start, but the more complicated discipline of a man who felt things strongly and had learned, mostly, to sit with them rather than acting immediately on them. Miss Bellamy, he said. Mara, she said. She'd been meaning to say it for 2 weeks. Caused. The name settled between them. Mara, he said. These numbers hold. They're not guarantees, she said quickly. Estimates based on what I know. There are variables I can't. I know they're not guarantees, he said. He wasn't looking at the ledger anymore. He was looking at her. I know what they are. I know what you did to get to them. He stopped. I didn't ask you to do this. No. You came here for 30 days to prove something about a smokehouse. Yes. And instead he stopped again. Looked away briefly. Looked back. I don't have words that are right for what you've done here. Don't need to find them, she said. We still have 12 days before the payment deadline, and possibly another spy in your operation, and a buyer to convince on Wednesday, and a rumor to kill before it reaches someone we can't recover from. She picked up the ledger. Time for the rest of it later. She meant the words as a redirection. As she said them, there's time for the rest of it. Later she heard them differently than she'd intended, and from the way his expression shifted, so did he. She didn't take them back. Wednesday came with clouds and a cold wind, and Vernon Driscoll, who arrived at the ranch in a buckboard with a man she didn't recognize riding alongside. Driscoll was nothing like Chast, where Chast had been quiet and evaluative. Driscoll was loud and definite, the buyer who'd made his fortune by making quick decisions and rarely revisiting them. Came into the yard talking, before he'd even climbed down, asking about the rumors, saying he'd heard things, and he liked to get things straight before he committed to anything, saying he'd been in this business long enough to know that where there was smoke there was usually fire, and he hoped they understood. Mara was standing in the yard when he said this. She let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Driscoll, would you come inside, please?" She had arranged the kitchen table, the 5 signed statements from Garrett's hotel, organized and legible, her own production records open to the relevant pages. List Cleet had compiled of every person in the county who'd eaten Sterling beef in the past 30 days, with contact information for each. Driscoll sat down and looked at all of it. "I've got 31 names on that list," she said. "Every one of them ate product from this operation within the past 4 weeks. Cleet Durbin, who's been on this ranch 11 years. Take you to any of them today personally, right now, and you can ask them yourself how they're feeling." Driscoll looked at the statements. He looked at the list. He looked at her. "Somebody's been spreading this story," she said. "I don't think it's a coincidence that it started 4 days after our first successful delivery to Garrett's hotel chain. I think someone has a reason to want this operation to fail, and I think you're smart enough to know that a rumor without a single sick person attached to it isn't evidence of anything, except that someone is afraid of what we're building here." Driscoll was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man recalculating. A man who'd ridden in with him silent the whole time, watching everything, leaned over and said something quietly. Driscoll listened, nodded. "My associate has a question," Driscoll said. "Says he wants to know about your process. Not the proof about the illness, he's satisfied with that. Wants to know about the curing process itself, specifically whether it can be scaled." Mara looked at the associate for the first time. He was older than Driscoll by at least 10 years, with the patient eyes of someone who spent a lot of time listening rather than talking. "Yes," she said, "it can be scaled. We've already started. We have 5 men fully trained in the process and 2 more learning. Method doesn't depend on one person. It depends on understanding the principles, which is teachable." She paused. "Why?" The associate glanced at Driscoll, then back at her. "Because I'm not a buyer," he said. "I'm Driscoll's partner. And we've been looking for an operation in this territory to anchor a larger supply arrangement for the northern districts." He paused. "Not a one-time contract. A partnership." The word fell into the room and sat there. Mara heard it. She kept her face exactly where it was. "Kind of partnership," she said. "The kind where we supply capital for expansion and you supply product and method. Revenue split, long-term agreement, preference rights on volume." He spoke simply, like he was describing weather. "We've been looking for the right operation for 2 years. We hadn't found it until Driscoll heard Garrett talking about this place." She thought about the clause in Wyatt's debt arrangement. One that said, if Blackwood called the debt, he could take not just the land but any commercial enterprise built on it. She thought about 12 days. She thought about Reeves and the scrape on the latch and what it meant that Blackwood knew enough to be escalating. "I need to discuss this with Mr. Sterling," she said. "Of course," said the associate. "Can you stay tonight?" Driscoll looked at his associate. The associate said, "We can stay tonight." She went to find Wyatt. She found him in the north pasture and told him in 60 seconds what had happened at the table. He listened without interrupting, which was something she'd come to rely on. When she finished, it was quiet for 10 seconds, she counted. Not impatiently, just aware of the time. "They want a partnership," he said. "Long-term. Capital for expansion." Looked across the pasture. The mountains were dark blue in the afternoon light. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk was making its slow circle. "We take their capital," he said, "and Blackwood calls the debt before we've made the payment. He can claim the enterprise," she said. "Yes, I thought of that. The sequence matters." "The sequence matters exactly," she said. Pay Blackwood first. Then we talked to Driscoll's partner about expansion. 12 days, he said. 11 now, he nodded. Kept looking at the mountains. Missoula contract paid out this morning. She straightened. Cleet told me there was a deposit. More than estimated, he said. He looked at her. The Missoula buyer increased his order. Sent the difference this morning. Cleet has it. She did the arithmetic. Fast and then slow to make sure. Wyatt, she said. I know, that's close. That's very close. With the Bozeman income and the Missoula addition, we're within range, he said. Depends on nothing going wrong in the next 11 days. She thought of the scrape on the latch. Of Reeves, who hadn't come back. Tell me something, she said. He looked at her. How much does Blackwood know about the partnership conversation? The Driscoll meeting today, could word have gotten out? Wyatt frowned. Driscoll's name wasn't known to many people. I didn't advertise the meeting. But if someone on this ranch sent word to Helena in the past week, he understood immediately. Then Blackwood knows we're close, and knows a partnership would change the scale of what we're building. Which means he may not wait for the payment deadline to try something, she said. He may move sooner. The wind moved through the grass between them. Far down the slope, the smokehouse chimney was putting up a thin line of smoke into the cloudy sky. Steady. Real. Everything they'd built in 30-something days visible in that one rising line. Stay close to the smokehouse tonight, Wyatt said. I was going to, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in it, she recognized the particular look of a person who wanted to say something more, and had decided, for now, that the practical thing was more urgent. I'll talk to Driscoll and his partner at supper, he said. Tell them we're interested. Keep them here. He paused. And I'll post 2 men on the smokehouse tonight. She nodded. Mara. He said her name the way he'd said it once before, not as a formality, but as something deliberate. Almost there. I know, she said. She didn't say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that almost there was not the same as there, and that the distance between those two things was exactly where everything could still go wrong. She went back to the smokehouse, checked the fire, checked the flue, checked the latch and the secondary lock she'd added without telling anyone, checked the records she'd hidden in the place only she knew about. Then she sat down on the stool near the firebox and watched the fire and waited for the night to come. Outside, the 2 men Wyatt had posted took their positions without complaint, which told her he'd explained enough for them to understand what they were guarding. Fire burned steady. The smoke rose clean 11 days. The night passed without incident, which should have been a relief, but wasn't. Mara had slept in 3-hour stretches, waking between them to listen to the ranch settle and breathe around her. Each time she woke to silence, she felt not reassured but more alert. The way you feel when you're waiting for a sound, and it keeps not coming. 2 men Wyatt had posted outside the smokehouse were still there. At dawn she checked, and the latch was undisturbed, and the fire had held through the night at the temperature she'd banked it to. Everything was fine. That was the problem. She'd learned in her uncle's operation that the worst trouble rarely announced itself. Days before something broke were often the quietest ones, because the person planning the break was also waiting, also watching, also deciding exactly when the moment was right. Silence wasn't safety. Sometimes silence was just someone being patient. Driscoll and his partner, whose name she'd learned at supper, was Edmund Farr, had stayed the night as agreed. At breakfast, Wyatt had sat with them and talked through the shape of a potential arrangement without committing to terms, which was the right approach, and she'd been glad he'd taken it. Farr was the kind of man who respected patience. Been building supply networks for 20 years, and he understood that a rancher who jumped at the first favorable offer was either desperate or foolish, and that neither made a reliable long-term partner. Wyatt was neither, and Farr seemed to see that clearly enough by the end of the meal. They left mid-morning with an agreement to correspond. No signed papers, no terms, just the particular quality of handshake that meant both sides were genuinely interested and knew it. Mara watched them go from the porch. 10 days. Reeves disappeared on the 3rd day after Driscoll's visit. Not dramatically, he didn't pack a visible bag or say anything to the other men. He was simply absent from the North Range crew at the morning assignment, and when Cleet sent Tommy to check the bunkhouse, his bunk had been stripped and his personal effects were gone. Clet came to find Mara first before Wyatt, which she noted but didn't remark on. Gone, Cleet said. She was in the smokehouse. She didn't stop what she was doing immediately. She finished checking the cut she was examining, set it back on the rack, and then turned around. When, she said. Sometime last night, after supper from the look of it. Anyone see him go? Nobody's saying so. Cleet paused. Which might mean nobody saw. Or might mean somebody saw and isn't talking. She thought about that. The latch, she said. Check it. Cleet went to the smokehouse door and looked at the latch she'd been monitoring since Sunday. Looked at it for a moment, came back. New scratch, she said. Lower than the first one. So Reeves had tried the door and found the secondary lock, she'd added. When? And then either because he hadn't gotten what he needed or because he'd been recalled he'd gone. Went back to report, she said. Report what? Cleet asked. That he couldn't get in. That the operation is more protected than it looks. That we know someone's watching. She paused. Which means Blackwood is going to stop sending quiet men and start doing something louder. Cleet was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who's scared easily. 11 years on a ranch like this didn't produce that, but he had the look of someone accounting for a threat he hadn't quite expected to be as real as it was. How long do we have? He asked. Until Blackwood decides the deadline is too close to wait, she said. 7 days now. If I were him and I knew this operation was about to generate enough income to make the payment, I would move in the next 4. 4 days, at most. He looked at her steadily. What do you need? Tell Wyatt, she said. Tonight. Double the men on the smokehouse, but not obviously. Spread them out. Anyone watching from a distance shouldn't be able to count them. He nodded and left. She turned back to the smokehouse and kept working, because the only thing she could control was the work, and the work still had to get done. She told Wyatt herself that evening, which was not a contradiction of what she'd told Cleet, but an addition to it. Cleet would give Wyatt the tactical information. She needed to give him something else. She found him at the fence line on the east pasture, the one that had been repaired early in her time on the ranch, now solid and straight, in a way it hadn't been the morning. She'd noticed the broken posts from Tommy's wagon. He was checking it in the last light, running his hand along the top rail, with the particular attention of a man who needed to be looking at something concrete while he thought about something abstract. She came up beside him, and they stood at the fence for a moment without speaking. Cleet told me, he said. I figured Reeves. Yes. He was quiet. He looked down the fence line. My father built this fence. First one on the property. He said the mark of a working ranch wasn't the cattle or the house. It was the fences. You could tell everything about how a man ran his operation by whether his fences held. She looked at the fence. It was good work, old, but maintained, the kind of structure that had been repaired so many times in specific places that it was partly original and partly the accumulated effort of everyone who'd come after. Your father was right, she said. He looked at her sideways. He was right about a lot of things, and I spent most of my life trying not to admit it. She almost smiled. That sounds familiar. You had the same problem with your father? My uncle, she said, but close enough. She paused. He was right about everything that mattered, and impossible to thank for it, because thanking him would have meant admitting he'd been right, and by the time I understood that it was too late to tell him directly. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He's gone? 6 years ago. She looked at the mountains, blue dark in the failing light. Rebuilt the business, eventually. Smaller than before, but his. Died knowing it was solid. That's something. It's a lot, she said. It took me a while to see how much. Next 4 days. She said, if Blackwood moves. I know. He won't come himself, she said. Men like him don't do the thing they can pay someone else to do. But whoever he sends will have instructions to do something that can't be undone. Something that makes the payment impossible. The smokehouse, Wyatt said.
Yes.
Or the contracts, he said, if he could get to Garrett or Chast before the deadline. He's already tried that with the rumor, and it didn't hold, she said. Go for something physical now. Something immediate. She paused. Fire is the most efficient. The word sat between them. He didn't flinch from it. She'd expected he might not from weakness. Because this was his property. His father's fence. His mother's ranch. All of it. But he looked at the word the same way he looked at everything difficult. Directly. Without drama. With the particular steadiness of a man who'd learned that flinching didn't make anything better. The smokehouse or the barn, he said. The barn is more visible from the road and more spectacular if it goes up, she said. The goal is to create chaos that disrupts the operation and delays the payment. Burning the barn achieves that faster than the smokehouse. The goal is specifically to destroy what we've built. Then they go for the smokehouse. If I were advising Blackwood, she said, I'd say go for both. Start with the barn to draw everyone to that side of the yard. Then, while the hands are fighting the barn fire, someone goes for the smokehouse. Wyatt looked at her. You've thought about this a lot, he said. Since Monday, she said, when I found the second scratch on the latch. Quiet for a long moment. The light was almost gone now. First stars were beginning in the east. If they fire the barn, he said slowly, the instinct will be to fight the barn.
Yes.
But the barn can be rebuilt. Yes, the smokehouse, the contracts, the buyers, the operation. Takes considerably longer to rebuild, she said. It can be rebuilt at all, in the time we have. She held her gaze in the near dark. So if the barn goes up, you want me to leave it. I want the men on the smokehouse, she said. I know what that costs. I know what's in that barn. But the barn is wood and equipment, and those things can be replaced. What we've built in that smokehouse is. She stopped. Harder to replace, he said. Yes, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped, if this was the place where the practical thing and the personal thing came apart in a way that couldn't be bridged. She was asking him to watch something that mattered to him burn. He said, all right, just that. 2 words. All right, he said again. The barn goes, the men go to the smokehouse. He looked at the fence one last time. Post Cleet near the smokehouse tonight. Tell him what you told me. She nodded. They walked back toward the house together in the dark. The fire started on the 5th night. The 4th, as she'd calculated. The 5th, which meant she'd been wrong by 1 day, which was close enough to right that it didn't matter, and far enough to have made the waiting worse. She'd spent the 4th night at the highest level of alertness she could sustain, listening to everything. And by the morning of the 5th day, she'd had to accept that she couldn't hold that edge indefinitely and had slept 3 hours in the afternoon, like a person preparing for something. She woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke that was wrong. Not the clean, managed smoke of the smokehouse firebox. She knew that smell as well as she knew her own breathing by now, knew its weight and its direction, and the particular way it moved through the night air when the wind was coming from the west. This was different, thicker, the kind of smoke that came from things not meant to burn. She was dressed, and out of the housekeeper's room in under a minute. Barn was on the south side of the yard, and it was already going when she got outside, not smoldering, not starting, going, with the particular orange confidence of a fire that had been given an advantage before anyone noticed it. Heat was pushing across the yard from 40 feet away. Above the barn, the smoke column was black and heavy, and rising fast enough to blot out the stars on the south side. Ranch was already waking. She could hear shouting from the bunkhouse, boots on boards, the particular sound of men moving urgently from sleep to action. She ran toward the smokehouse. Cleet was already there. He'd been posted near it, she'd asked, and he had 2 other men with him. When they were standing at the door and looking at the barn like every instinct they had was pulling them in that direction, and the only thing stopping them was whatever Wyatt had told them. Barn, one of the men said she didn't know his name. He was one of the newer hands. He said it like it was enough of a sentence. I know, Cleet said. Hold. The man looked at Cleet, then at the fire. Then at Mara, who had arrived at a dead run and was already looking not at the barn, but at the tree line behind the smokehouse. There, she said. A shape, moving, coming from the tree line toward the back of the smokehouse, fast and low in the way that people move when they're hoping not to be seen. Cleet saw it in the same instant she did. He didn't shout. He took 2 steps left and came around the corner of the smokehouse at an angle that cut off the shape's approach. On the other 2 men moved with him with the precision of people who'd been told exactly what to look for and had the good sense to act when they saw it. Mara stayed at the smokehouse door. She heard the scuffle short, sharp, the sound of a brief struggle on hard ground. Then Cleet's voice, calm and flat, then nothing. Then Cleet's voice again. Got him. She let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like a long time. Turned back toward the barn. The fire was enormous. Now the south wall had gone, and the roof was beginning to go, and the light of it threw the whole yard into a terrible orange brightness that made everything look like it was happening on a stage. Most of the crew was there, working the waterline, trying to contain the spread to the structure itself and keep it from jumping to the fence line or the feed store. She could see Wyatt in the middle of it. He was not watching the fire the way a man watches something burn. He was working it, directing the waterline, moving men to the right positions, doing the job with the full concentration of someone who'd made peace with the loss and was focused on containing it. Covered in soot, and the heat was visible from where she stood, pushing against him in waves, and he did not step back from it. She watched him for a moment. Then she went inside the smokehouse and checked the firebox, the flue, the racks, the locks on the secondary door. Everything was as she'd left it. The fire in the firebox was burning clean and steady. East firebox, which had become her backup and her secret these past weeks, was intact. She sat down on the stool and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Outside, the barn finished dying with a long, deep sound like something giving up. Fire collapsed inward rather than outward, which meant Wyatt and the crew had managed the water line well enough to keep it contained. Feed store was safe. The fence line on the east side showed scorching but held. Barn was gone. The smokehouse stood. Man Cleet had caught at the back of the smokehouse, was named Duff, and he was not from the ranch, had never been on it before that night, and he had in his jacket pocket a glass bottle of kerosene with a rag stuffed in the neck, which was simple and direct in the way that hired men's plans tended to be. He also had, folded small in his shirt pocket, a piece of paper. Cleet brought it to Wyatt at dawn. When the barn site was still smoldering, and the crew was exhausted and covered in ash, and sitting in the yard with water cups and the particular silence of people who have fought something together and don't have words yet for what that was. Wyatt unfolded the paper. Mara stood beside him. It was a set of instructions. Handwritten, specific, and signed with initials rather than a name, but the initials were S. B. And the instructions described the Sterling Ranch's layout with an accuracy that could only have come from someone with recent, detailed knowledge of the property, which meant Reeves had provided it before he left. Wyatt looked at the paper for a long time. His face was still the controlled thing, the flat steadiness, but she could see the edges of it now, the place where the control was being maintained by effort rather than ease. Connects him, she said quietly. The instructions. Kerosene, Duff. If Duff talks, Wyatt said. He might if he understands his situation clearly. She paused. He was hired to burn down a man's property. That's not a light charge. Someone can explain to him that the man who hired him has the resources to disappear behind lawyers while Duff serves the sentence alone. He'll need convincing, Wyatt said. Yes. Who does that convincing? She thought about it. Not you. If you go at him directly, he'll assume you're trying to trap him into something worse. She paused. Cleet. Wyatt looked at Cleet, who was standing nearby with the look of a man who'd already been thinking along the same lines. Tell him the truth, Mara said to Cleet. Just the truth. What the charge is, what it means without help, what it could mean with it. She paused. And tell him that what we need isn't his head. We need the person above him. Cleet nodded once and went. Wyatt watched him go. Then he looked at the barn site, the collapsed walls, the blackened earth, the ruin of a structure that had stood on this property since his father built it. She waited beside him. She didn't try to make it smaller than it was. My father put that barn up in the summer of 1861, he said. Not to her specifically, to the heir of the morning. He and 3 other men. Took them 11 days. He used to say that was the summer he understood what the ranch was going to be. She said nothing. Sometimes saying nothing was the right thing. I watched this man burn it down in 40 minutes, he said. Yes. He was quiet. The smokehouse is standing, she said. Not to make it better. Just because it was true and he might need to hear it named. Gaw, he looked at her. There was ash on his face, and in his hair and his eyes were red from the smoke. And he was the most present she'd ever seen him, stripped of the controlled distance. Just a man standing in the wreckage of something his father built, holding himself together with the particular effort of someone who has decided that falling apart is not an option right now. Thank you, he said, for the smokehouse, for posting Cleet, for all of it. I told you what we needed to do, she said. Did it. Don't do that, he said. She looked at him. Don't reduce what you did, he said. You figured out what Blackwood was going to do before he did it. Told me to leave the barn and save the smokehouse. And I did it because you were right, and I knew you were right. He held her gaze. That matters. You matter. Don't make it smaller. She held his gaze for a moment. The morning light was coming in cold and gray over the mountains, and the smoke from the barn site was thinning out into the sky, and the crew was starting to move again, slowly. The way people move when the emergency is over and the ordinary work is waiting. She didn't make it smaller. Okay, she said. He nodded. Duff talked by mid-morning. Not easily and not completely. He was not a man inclined toward full cooperation, but enough. He confirmed that he'd been hired through a man in Helena who worked, as he put it, freight and arrangements for Silas Blackwood. He confirmed that the instructions in his pocket had been given to him by that man. He confirmed that he'd been paid half his fee before and was promised the other half after the smokehouse was destroyed. He did not know, or would not say, whether there had been other instructions beyond the barn and the smokehouse, whether Blackwood had additional plans. whether there was a larger move coming. What he gave them was enough. Cleet took the statement, such as it was, spoken in the presence of 2 witnesses, and Wyatt wrote it down in his own hand and had Cleet and both witnesses sign the page. Then he rode to town himself, that same afternoon, to find the county sheriff and put the paper in front of him. The sheriff's name was Ira Birch. He had been aware of Silas Blackwood in the general way that county law enforcement was aware of powerful men, knowing they existed and that they operated, but not necessarily knowing the specifics of how, or caring to find out unless given a direct reason. Wyatt gave him a direct reason. He came back that evening with 2 things: receipt acknowledging the statement and the information that Birch had. That same afternoon, sent a wire to Helena requesting that a territorial investigator be dispatched. Wire was a beginning, not an end. These things moved slowly, and Mara knew it. But Blackwood didn't know what had been sent, and the deadline was 6 days away. Crew rebuilt what they could of the barn in those 6 days. Not all of it that was impossible in the time, and the resources needed to be focused elsewhere, but they cleared the site and salvaged what was usable and put up a temporary structure for the equipment and the horses that had been moved out in the chaos of the fire night. The work had a different quality than the regular maintenance work, more driven, less routine, the particular energy of people who were working against something rather than simply for something. She watched them and understood what she was seeing. They had fought something together, and some of them had lost sleep, and some of them were still covered in ash metaphorically, even after they'd washed it off physically. And they were working the way people work when they've decided that the outcome matters to them personally. Tommy came to her on the 2nd day after the fire and said, without preamble, "Are we going to make it?" She looked at him, 17 years old, covered in new sawdust over old ash, with the direct gaze of someone who'd decided he was old enough to ask the real question. "Yes," she said. "How sure are you?" She thought about giving him the careful answer, the one with the qualifications and the variables. Then she thought about what he was actually asking, which was not for a financial analysis, but for something to hold on to. "Sure enough," she said. He nodded, went back to work. She went back to the smokehouse. The final contracts arrived by post on the 4th day after the fire. The second Billings buyer, who'd been pending, committed in writing to a 3-month trial arrangement at the rate she'd proposed. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table and ran the numbers in her head one more time and got the same answer she'd been getting for 3 days. They had enough. Not with room to breathe, the margin was real but not comfortable, but enough. Enough to make the payment, clear the debt, and have something left to start the next month with. Put the letter down on the table. Wyatt was standing in the doorway. He'd come in while she was reading and hadn't said anything. "We have it," she said. He came to the table and looked at the letter. Didn't pick it up. He read it where it lay. "The full amount," he said, "plus the Missoula addition and the Bozeman standing payment." She paused. With $11 left over, he looked up from the letter. $11. $11, she said. "It's not much of a buffer." "No," he said, "it isn't." He looked at the letter again. Then, unexpectedly, laughed a short, real sound, the kind that comes out before a person decides whether it's appropriate. $11. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. "When does Blackwood come?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "Come early. He likes arriving before people are ready." She nodded. She knew what the next 2 days needed to look like: the payment organized, the documentation prepared, every number clean and accounted for in writing. She'd been preparing the ledger pages for a week, updating them each day, so that when the moment came there would be nothing to scramble for. "I'll have everything ready," she said. He looked at her across the table. Morning light came through the window, and the kitchen was quiet, and the ranch outside was the particular peaceful noisy of a working place, going about its day tools and horses and men's voices and the thin line of smoke from the smokehouse rising clean into the sky. "Mara," he said. She waited. After this is over, he stopped. Looked at the window. Looked back. He was not a man who found this kind of sentence easy, and she'd known that since the first day, and she waited without helping him. "I know the 30 days ended a while ago," he said. 2 weeks ago," she said. "You stayed. There was still work." "There's always going to be work," he said. "On a ranch this size. There's never not work." He held her gaze. "That's not why I'm saying it." She was quiet. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not for the smokehouse. Not for the contracts or the buyers or the numbers." Because he stopped. Started again. "Because this ranch is different than it was 6 weeks ago." Because I'm different than I was 6 weeks ago." And both of those things are connected to you being here, and I don't know what either of them looks like if you leave. Kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him, at the ash that was still faintly visible in the crease of one ear that he'd missed when he washed, at the new lines of tiredness around his eyes, at the way he was holding himself, not with the armor from the beginning, but with something more complicated and more real. She thought about the housekeeper's room with the door that locked from the inside, about Tommy asking if they were going to make it, about the 5 signed statements from Garrett's hotel staff spread across this same table, about Cleet coming to find her first, before Wyatt, when Reeves disappeared. Because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, the hierarchy of who needed to know things first had quietly shifted. She thought about the letter her uncle had written her, 2 months before he died, which she'd never shown anyone, in which he'd said that the hardest thing he'd ever learned was the difference between being somewhere because you had to be and being somewhere because you chose to be, and that the second one was the only kind of life that was actually yours. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, you'll stay. Or okay, you heard me. Okay, I'll stay, she said. Rex hailed, once slow. Gone for just a moment, his face was completely unguarded, no control. No distance. Just a man who'd asked for something important and been given it and hadn't quite prepared for the feeling of that. Then he straightened. He picked up the letter from the Billings buyer and set it with the other papers. Day after tomorrow, he said. Blackwood comes at 7. I'll be ready at 6, she said. He nodded. He went to the door. Stopped Mara, the $11. She looked up. Next month, he said, it'll be more. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. It will. He went out into the morning, and she turned back to the ledger, and outside the smokehouse kept putting up its clean line of smoke into the wide Montana sky. She was up at 5:30, which was 30 minutes before she'd told Wyatt she'd be ready. Because that was who she was, she'd always needed the extra time not to prepare the materials but to prepare herself. Sit in the quiet before something significant and let it be what it was without rushing at it. Ledger was already complete. She'd finished it the night before, cross-checked it twice, and set it on the kitchen table with the payment documentation organized beneath it in the order she'd want to present it. Contracts were there. The receipts. The signed statements from Garrett's hotel. Record of every transaction since the Smokehouse had started running, written in her hand, clean and precise and impossible to argue with if you were arguing in good faith. If you were arguing in bad faith, none of it would matter. But that was a different problem. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the ranch come up into the early light. Barn site was still raw. The temporary structure they'd built sat on the east edge of the cleared ground, functional and graceless, the way temporary things always were. Smokehouse, 40 feet away, looked exactly as it had when she'd first walked into it 6 weeks ago from the outside. Solid, quiet, unchanged by everything that had happened around it. She thought about the morning she'd arrived. Tommy driving the wagon, not saying much. The way she'd noticed the broken fence posts before she'd noticed anything else. The smokehouse standing dark and unused in the yard like a problem that nobody had gotten around to naming yet. She'd named it. That was all she'd done, really, in the beginning. Named what was wrong and said what could be done about it and asked for 30 days. Contracts, buyers, a trained crew, a saved operation, all of that had come from the naming. From the willingness to look directly at the thing that wasn't working and say so out loud, instead of moving around it politely. Most problems she'd ever seen were not mysteries. They were things people already knew about and hadn't said clearly. She heard Wyatt's boots on the stairs at 5:45. Came into the kitchen and saw the coffee and the organized table and looked at her and said nothing, just poured himself a cup and stood beside her at the window. They watched the morning together. He'll come with lawyers, Wyatt said finally. Not worried. Just naming it. Probably, she said. It won't matter. Because the numbers are right. Because the numbers are right, she said. And because they're documented. And because if he tries to dispute any of it, the documentation is better than anything he can produce. Wyatt was quiet. He looked at the barn site. If the investigation moves forward, he said. Birch and the territorial man. It'll be slow, she said. These things always are. But Duff's statement is on record. Yes. And the paper from his pocket and the witness identification of the Helena rider. She paused. Blackwood's lawyers will try to create distance between him and all of it. They'll have arguments. But arguments and evidence are different things, and what's on record is evidence. Wyatt nodded. It won't be finished today, she said. I want to be clear about that. Today is one thing, the payment, the debt cleared. The larger problem is a different timeline. I know, he said. Stopped expecting things to be finished all at once a few weeks ago. Glanced at him. You disabused me of that habit, he said. Dry but not unkind. She looked back at the window. The sun was coming over the eastern ridge now, long and low, kind of early light that made the whole landscape look deliberate, like someone had arranged it. Comes at 7, she said. He comes at 7, he agreed. She picked up her coffee cup. Then we have an hour. Silas Blackwood arrived at 6:58, which was either punctual or 2 minutes early, depending on your interpretation, and Mara suspected his interpretation was the latter. He came in the same carriage as always, the good one, the one that announced money before the man got out of it with 2 men on horseback alongside, and a third man in the carriage with him who was clearly the lawyer. The lawyer had the look of lawyers who worked for wealthy men in the territories. Expensive coat, cheap eyes, practiced expression of someone paid to find problems in other people's documents. Mara was standing on the porch when they pulled in. Wyatt was beside her. Cleet was in the yard, not positioned obviously, but present in the way that mattered. Tommy was at the Smokehouse. She'd told him to keep working this morning, to be visible and purposeful, because the best thing the Smokehouse could do today was exist loudly. Blackwood got out of the carriage and looked at the yard. His eyes went to the barn site first. He'd heard about the fire. She was certain of it, and the look he gave the cleared ground was not surprise but assessment, the look of a man checking on a result. Then his eyes moved to the Smokehouse, where the chimney was already producing its clean morning smoke, and something happened in his expression that he controlled quickly but not quickly enough. Then he looked at Mara. She held his gaze. He walked to the porch. The lawyer came behind him. The 2 riders stayed with the carriage. Sterling, Blackwood said. He didn't look at Mara when he said it, which was deliberate. Believe we have business today. We do, Wyatt said. Come inside. The kitchen table had been cleared of everything except the payment documentation and the ledger. Mara had thought carefully about what to leave visible and what to put away. Contracts she'd secured were in a separate folder to one side, not hidden, but not centered. Center of the table was the payment. That was what today was about. Blackwood sat. The lawyer sat beside him and opened his own case and produced his own papers, which was expected. Wyatt sat across from them. Mara stood to his right, which was not behind him and not beside him, in a way that announced itself just present, at the table, with the ledger in her hands. Blackwood looked at her properly for the first time. I don't believe I know your role here, he said. It was the tone of a man who knew precisely her role and was choosing to make it a question. I manage the Smokehouse operation, she said, and the accounts associated with it. He looked at Wyatt. You brought in outside management. I brought in capable management, Wyatt said, plain and without heat. Blackwood smiled the way he smiled with his mouth and nothing else. I see. Gessa, he gestured to the lawyer, who produced the debt agreement, the original, thick and official and signed 18 months ago, with the clause she'd memorized buried on the 3rd page, where people who were relieved to have money in hand often forgot to look carefully. The amount due, the lawyer said, reading from his own document, as of today's date, including all accrued interest, is. Mara opened the ledger to the page she'd prepared and set it on the table, facing the lawyer. We have the same figure, she said. The lawyer looked at the number she'd written, looked at his own document. His expression did something small that he covered. Payment? Wyatt said. Cleet came in from the doorway he'd been just outside, which Blackwood hadn't registered or had chosen not to acknowledge, and set the bank draft on the table. Full amount. Exact figure. The right date, the right names, properly drawn from the bank in town where Wyatt had gone 3 days ago to have it prepared. Blackwood looked at the draft. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he did not believe would be there. She watched him do it and felt not triumph. She'd told herself not to expect triumph, because the feeling was premature and expensive, and she'd learned that from her uncle's example, but something quieter. Kind of settled certainty. The arithmetic had been right. Work had been real. The thing that was supposed to happen was happening. The lawyer picked up the draft and examined it. He examined it for longer than was necessary, which told her he was looking for a problem that wasn't there. After a moment, he set it down and said something quietly to Blackwood that she couldn't hear. Blackwood's jaw moved. The clause, he said, looking at Wyatt, guarding commercial enterprises on the property. I'm familiar with the clause, Wyatt said. The Smokehouse operation. Covered by the payment, Mara said. The clause applies only in the event of default. There is no default. The full amount is on the table. She paused. On today's date. Blackwood looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that was meant to be uncomfortable, and she met it without adjusting. "Been thorough," he said. "I try to be," she said. He looked at Wyatt. "You're satisfied with this arrangement?" "Management by," he gestured slightly in her direction, the gesture doing the work of the sentence he didn't finish. "I'm satisfied with this operation," Wyatt said. "And with the person who built it." Blackwood was quiet for a moment. He looked at the draft again. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the folder of contracts that she'd left visible to the side, not emphasized. But there. He was reading the room the same way she'd been reading it, with the same professional attention to what was visible and what it meant. He saw the contracts. He understood what they represented. She watched him understand. This was not just a payment. It was a ranch that had, in the past 6 weeks, transformed itself into something different from what it had been when he'd written the debt agreement. Something harder to threaten. Something with buyers and relationships and a revenue base that extended beyond the land itself, which meant that even the clause, the one that would have let him take not just the land, but the enterprise, was now pointing at something considerably larger and more complicated than he'd planned for when he'd drafted it. He had written that trap for the ranch that existed 18 months ago. The ranch that existed today was a different animal. She'd known this for a week. She was watching him know it now. Picked up the draft. He looked at it once more. "Ah?" Then he nodded to his lawyer, who began preparing the receipt of payment with the particular efficient movements of a man who had accepted that his part in this was administrative. "Full payment received," the lawyer said, writing. "Debt satisfied. All encumbrances released." He looked at Blackwood. Blackwood nodded once. The lawyer signed. He slid the receipt across the table to Wyatt, who looked at it, then at Mara, who looked at the numbers and nodded. Wyatt signed. It was done. Blackwood stood. He buttoned his coat. He'd never taken it off, which was either a sign of confidence or of a man who'd planned to leave quickly, and looked around the kitchen once, the way he'd looked around the parlor on the day he'd come in without knocking and dropped a paper on the table and left mud on the floor. He looked smaller in here than he had in the parlor. She wasn't sure if that was the room or whether something about him had actually diminished in the past hour. "Congratulations," he said. The word was entirely without content. "Thank you for coming yourself," Wyatt said. Just as empty, just as polite. Blackwood left. The lawyer went after him. The carriage pulled out of the yard, and Mara watched it go from the kitchen window, the same window where she and Wyatt had stood that morning drinking coffee in the early light. Yard was quiet. Wyatt let out a breath beside her. Cleet, from the doorway, said, "That's done, then." "Done," Wyatt said. Tommy, who had apparently abandoned the smokehouse at some point and was now standing beside Cleet in the doorway, said, "Did it work?" "Work, Tommy," Cleet said. Tommy nodded with the gravity of someone filing important information. Then he went back to the smokehouse. Territorial investigator arrived 11 days later. His name was Aldous Webb, and he was a lean, gun-hurried man in his early 50s who had spent 20 years following money through the Montana and Dakota territories, and had the particular patience of someone who'd learned that most people, given enough time and enough silence, told you what you needed to know without being asked directly. Came without announcement, just rode into the yard on a Tuesday afternoon and asked for Wyatt Sterling by name and showed his credentials to Cleet before Cleet would bring him inside, which Webb seemed to find reasonable. Talked to Wyatt first for 2 hours. Then he asked to speak with Mara, which she'd expected. She told him everything she knew in the order she'd come to know it: the ruined batch, Clay in the flue, the South pasture man, Reeves in the latch, Duff in the fire, the initialed paper in Duff's pocket. She told him about the rumor campaign and the letter she'd sent to Garrett and the witness statement she'd gathered. She told him about the rider from the Helena Road that Cleet's man had identified. Webb listened. He took notes. He asked clarifying questions that were precise and without obvious direction. The questions of a man assembling a picture rather than confirming one he'd already drawn. At the end, he said, "Miss Bellamy, this is a significant amount of documentation for a 6-week period." "I keep records," she said. "Of everything?" "Of everything relevant," she said. "It's a habit from working operations where things go wrong. If you don't write it down when it happens, you can't prove it later." He looked at his notes. "Your uncle's operation in Iowa." She was slightly surprised he'd gotten to that already.
"Yes."
He lost it to fraud, to a man who was better prepared than he was. which isn't the same as fraud exactly, but ends up in the same place. Webb looked at her. And you learned from that. I try to, she said. Don't always succeed in applying what you've learned. You try. He nodded slowly. He closed his notebook. I'm going to need copies of everything you've shown me. I'll need to speak with Cleet Durbin and the man who identified the Helena rider. Of course, she said. He looked at the smokehouse through the window. The operation is running well? Better every week, she said. He nodded. He stood. This is going to take time, Miss Bellamy. I want to be clear about that. Blackwood has lawyers and resources, and he'll use both. This won't be resolved in a month. I know, she said. I told Mr. Sterling the same thing the morning after the fire. The evidence is real, Webb said, and real evidence is harder to argue away than people think when the person presenting it has been as careful as you have. He paused at the door. I appreciate the records. She nodded. He went out. Weeks that followed were not dramatic, which was its own kind of relief. Investigation moved the way Webb had said it would, slowly, with the patient accumulation of documentation that legal processes required. Were letters from Helena, some of them from Blackwood's lawyers, and some of them from Webb's office. Don Wyatt handled them, with Mara going over every response before it was sent, which had become the way they worked on anything that mattered. Prescott meeting happened 3 weeks after the payment, on a Thursday in October when the first real cold had come into the mountains, and the Smokehouse was running at a production level that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks earlier. Prescott turned out to be a methodical man who asked excellent questions and whose partnership offer was, when Mara sat down with the specifics, better than she'd hoped and more complex than she'd expected. She and Wyatt spent 3 evenings going through it at the kitchen table. On the second evening, somewhere around midnight, Wyatt looked up from the paper he'd been reading and said, "Going to need a real office." She looked at him. For what? For all of this. He gestured at the table, the contracts and the ledgers and the correspondence and the notes she'd been making in the margins of things. It's going to keep growing. We need a place to run it that isn't a kitchen table. She looked at the table, at the organized chaos of a business that had outgrown its original space. Could convert the small room off the south hall, she said. One that's used for storage. He looked at the ceiling briefly, mapping the house in his mind. That could work. It gets good light in the morning, she said. And it's close enough to the smokehouse to hear if something goes wrong, but far enough that the smoke doesn't come through. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her. You've already thought about this. I think about things, she said. You think about things constantly, he said. Even when you look like you're doing something else. She considered arguing with this and decided it was accurate enough not to bother. Prescott terms, she said, bringing them back to the paper. Prescott terms, he agreed. And they kept working. Blackwood's empire, as Webb had promised, did not collapse quickly. But it began to show its fractures within 2 months of the investigation beginning, and the fractures had a way of becoming visible once people knew to look for them. It turned out that the Sterling Ranch was not the only property Blackwood had maneuvered against. There were 3 other ranchers in the territory who had similar debt arrangements, similar experiences of sabotage that they'd attributed to bad luck, similar moments where they'd come close to losing what they'd built and hadn't quite understood why. Webb found them. And when he found them, they talked. Because men who have been sitting alone with the suspicion that something wrong happened to them will talk, given a credible listener. Larcenist Duff was the thread that pulled. He had, in the days since the fire, become increasingly aware of the gap between what Blackwood had paid him and what Blackwood could afford to pay his lawyers. And this awareness had produced a gradual willingness to be more specific about his instructions than he'd been on the morning after the fire. By November, he had given a full written statement naming names and describing arrangements in enough detail that Webb had what he needed to take the case to the next level. Mara heard about this from Webb directly, in a letter she received in December. Wrote plainly, without drama, the case against Blackwood had been formalized. Charges had been filed in territorial court, and the process was now in the hands of people with more authority than a county sheriff and a single investigator. It would still be slow, but it was moving. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a cold December morning and felt something release in her that she hadn't been aware she was still holding. She folded the letter and put it in the file she'd been keeping. Then she went to the converted room off the south hall, which was now a proper office. with a desk and 2 chairs and the relevant files organized on shelves that Wyatt had built himself over 2 weekends, with the focused attention of a man who decided that building something useful was a better use of a Sunday than anything else he could think of, and filed it under Blackwood, which was a file she hoped, eventually, to close. Smokehouse, by December, was running 3 shifts. She hadn't planned that. She'd planned for 2 maximum, based on the contracts in hand. Prescott's partnership had come through in early November, the terms finalized after a week of careful negotiation, and the capital it provided had allowed them to expand faster than the conservative timeline she'd set for herself. Second firebox had been added, properly built this time, by a craftsman Wyatt had brought from Bozeman. 2 more men had been trained in the full process, not quickly, not as a shortcut, but correctly, the same standards she'd applied to the original crew. She had sat down with Tommy in November and told him that the pace of growth meant she needed someone who could run the overnight shift with full authority. Tommy had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You're asking if I can do that." "I'm telling you I think you can," she said. "That's different." "I'm 17, he said. "I know how old you are," she said. "Your age is one fact about you. It's not the only one." He'd taken the overnight shift. Ran it well. Not perfectly, there had been 2 evenings, in the first 2 weeks, where he'd made decisions that she'd reviewed and corrected in the morning. She'd corrected them directly, and without softening it. And he'd listened without defensiveness, which was the quality she'd trusted most about him from the beginning. But by December, the corrections were rare. She mentioned this to Wyatt one evening, not as a report, but as an observation, the kind she'd gotten into the habit of sharing with him at the end of days when something had happened that seemed worth naming. He listened the way he listened to these observations, with full attention, without the impulse to respond immediately, which was a quality she'd come to appreciate more than almost anything about him. "Came to me last week," Wyatt said, asked about the expansion. "Whether we'd need another smokehouse eventually." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was a question for you." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" "I think eventually, yes," he said. "Not this year. Next year, maybe." He paused. "I think Tommy knows that, which is why he's asking." She nodded. "He's going to be running something someday," Wyatt said. "On his own. On another ranch or his own outfit eventually." "I know," she said. "You don't seem bothered by that." "I'm not," she said. "That's the point of teaching someone properly. If they stay only because they don't know enough to leave, you haven't taught them, you've just made yourself necessary. I'd rather teach someone well enough that they could go, and have them choose to stay." Wyatt looked at her. "Is that how you think about it generally? Or specifically about Tommy?" She met his eyes. The fire was burning in the stove, and the office was warm, and outside the Montana December was doing what it did, quiet and enormous and cold, in a way that made the inside feel like something you'd built and earned, rather than something you'd simply stumbled into. "Both," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the desk between them, the papers, the files, the ledger with this month's figures that she'd been updating when he'd come in. "Numbers," he said. "This month." "Better than last month," she said. "Which was better than the month before." "How much better?" She turned the ledger to face him. He looked at the figures. She watched him look at them. He'd gotten better at reading them, at reading what they meant, not just what they said. In the beginning, he'd looked at accounts the way a man looks at weather, aware that they mattered, vaguely attentive to the indicators, but not fluent in the language. Now, he read them the way she did, with the eye of someone who understood that every number was the record of a decision, and that the pattern of decisions over time told you something true about an operation. She taught him that, not explicitly, just by going over the numbers together, every week, explaining what she was seeing and why, until the seeing had transferred. "That's real," he said, pointing to a specific line. "That's the Prescott arrangement kicking in fully," she said. "The first 2 months were partial. Now it's running at the contracted rate. Garrett's standing contract renews in January. Same terms." He asked about expanding the order when I last wrote to him. Wyatt looked up. "Expanding. He's opening a 4th dining room. Wants to anchor the menu around the cured beef." She paused. He said, "I'll quote this exactly," he said. "I have stopped looking for a better source because I've concluded there isn't one." Wyatt was quiet. "That's the kind of thing," she said, "that my uncle never heard about his operation. Not because it wasn't true, but because he lost it before anyone had time to say so." She paused. "I think about that sometimes." "The timing," he said. "Timing," she said. How much depends on whether you manage to hold on long enough for things to become real. The operation was always there, the smokehouse, the cattle, the capacity. It just needed time and someone willing to do the work instead of waiting for circumstances to improve. He looked at her steadily. You don't think circumstances improve on their own? Sometimes they do, she said. But usually what looks like improved circumstances is just someone having done the unglamorous thing that needed doing while everyone else was waiting for something easier. He was quiet for a moment. My mother, he said. She wrote in that letter that I would feel she'd overstepped. You did, Mara said, at the beginning. Yes, he looked at the window, the dark December outside. She also wrote that I should do something useful with you. Which is, he stopped. That's not how I would describe what happened. How would you describe it? He thought about it. Actually, thought. The way he thought about things that mattered not immediately. Not with the first word that came, but carefully. I would say, he said slowly, that you came here with 30 days and you gave me back something I didn't know I was losing. Not just the operation, not just the money, he paused. Ranch, when my father ran it, was alive in a way that I'd let it stop being. I knew that, but I'd told myself it was circumstances. Prices, markets, the man who ran the smokehouse leaving. He looked at her. It wasn't circumstances. I'd stopped seeing what was there. You saw it, she held his gaze. You saw it too, she said. When I showed you. That's different, he said. Seeing something when someone shows it to you versus seeing it yourself. Sit, she said. I couldn't have shown you anything you weren't capable of seeing. I just went first. She paused. That's all it ever was. Someone has to go first. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. She could hear the faint sound of the smokehouse, not the fire, which was too distant and too insulated to hear from the house. But the structure itself, the way a working building makes sounds that distinguish it from one that isn't. A kind of presence, a kind of ongoing. I want to ask you something, he said. You can ask me anything, she said. When you came here, on the stage, what were you actually hoping for? She considered giving him the practical answer, the arrangement, the work, the chance at something different. All of it true. But he'd asked what she was hoping for, which was a more specific question. I was hoping to be useful somewhere it mattered, she said. I was hoping to find work that was real and have someone see that it was real. She paused. I was hoping to stop being somewhere I was tolerated instead of somewhere I was. She stopped. Needed, he said. Wanted, she said. Needed and wanted are different. My sister needed me the way you need furniture present and functional. I wanted to be somewhere that would notice if I was gone. She looked at the desk. I hadn't had that in a long time. The room was very quiet. You'd be noticed, he said, simply and completely. If you were gone. The operation, the crew, Tommy. He paused. Me. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that easily. She knew this with the certainty of someone who'd spent months in paying close attention. Words had cost him something, and he'd paid it without performing the cost, which was the only way she'd ever respected that kind of admission. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, he said, but I wanted to say it anyway, so you knew it was true. Ah. She looked at him across the desk, with all its papers and numbers and the records of everything they'd built, and she thought about what it meant to build something real with another person, not the romance of it, which was easy to idealize, but the actual substance of it. Evenings going over accounts, the corrections given and received without defensiveness, the fire night and the silence at the fence line and the $11 left over after the payment and the way he'd laughed about those $11 with a realness she hadn't expected. This was what her uncle had meant in that letter she'd never shown anyone. Difference between being somewhere because you had to be and being somewhere because you chose to be. She was choosing to be here. She'd been choosing it for a while. She'd just been waiting to be sure enough to know it completely. Something I want to say too, she said. He waited. Good at waiting. When I got on the stage in Billings, she said, I told myself I was making a rational decision. I'd researched the market and the buyers and the smokehouse situation, and that the risk was calculated, and that 30 days was a contained trial with a clear exit. She paused. All of that was true, and none of it was why I got on the stage. He looked at her, said nothing. I got on the stage because the letters, your mother's letters, described a place that sounded like it needed exactly what I knew how to do, she said. And I was tired of knowing how to do something and having no place where it mattered. She looked at him. I wasn't looking for a husband. I wasn't looking for a ranch. I was looking for work that was real, and people who were real, and something I could put my hands on that would still be there tomorrow. She paused. I found all of it. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside the wind had quieted. "Mara," he said. "Yes." "Well, I'd like to ask you properly," he said. "Not because my mother arranged it. Not because of the smokehouse or the contracts or anything practical. Because I'd like to build the rest of this with you beside me." He paused. "All of it. The work and everything else." She looked at him across the desk that had once been a storage room and was now the center of something real, in a house that had once been going under and was now going forward, on a ranch that had once been collapsing quietly and was now the loudest, most alive version of itself it had ever been. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He exhaled. It was a small sound, the exhale of a man who'd been holding something longer than he'd admitted. Nodded once, the nod she'd come to read as his version of the deepest kind of yes. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. "Gee," and they went back to the ledger. Because the numbers still needed finishing. Because that was who they were, people who did the work that was in front of them, even when other things were also true. People who believed that the ongoing ordinary labor of building something was not separate from love, but was in fact one of its most reliable expressions. Silas Blackwood was formally charged in territorial court in the spring, on counts that included fraud, conspiracy, criminal destruction of property. The process, as Webb had promised, was not fast, but it was thorough, and the evidence, the statements, the documentation, testimony of 3 ranchers besides Wyatt who had been systematically maneuvered toward default was the kind that held up under pressure because it had been gathered by people who understood that the truth needed to be organized as carefully as a lie if it was going to outlast one. It did not go quietly. His lawyers were expensive and inventive, and they delayed the proceedings for longer than was just. Delay is not the same as escape, and the evidence was what it was, and eventually the thing that was true became the thing that was decided. Blackwood's properties were seized, his arrangements unraveled. Men he'd employed in the work of other people's ruin found themselves standing in the same position they'd helped create for others. Which was not justice exactly. Justice is rarely as clean as people hope, but was at least the consequence of the thing, which is sometimes the best that can be managed. Sterling Ranch did not watch the fall with satisfaction. There was too much work to do for that. The second smokehouse was built the following year, in a location Mara had identified the previous winter as optimal for airflow and access. Tommy ran the original facility by then with full authority and was, by the end of that year, training a crew of his own, which was exactly what she'd told him would happen when she'd taught him everything she knew. He was 19 years old and took it as seriously as a much older person would have, and probably more carefully, because he hadn't yet accumulated the shortcuts that experience sometimes produces in people who stop questioning what they think they know. She watched him teach and recognized, with a feeling she couldn't quite name but didn't try to, the thing that her uncle must have felt watching her. Wyatt built the barn back in the summer. Not a replica of his father's, he didn't try to reconstruct it exactly, because trying to reconstruct what was gone exactly was the kind of project that defeated itself. He built something new in the same location, with some of the same timber where it was usable and new materials where it wasn't. It was larger than the original, better lit, arranged differently, because the operation had changed, and the barn needed to reflect what the operation was now rather than what it had been. He worked on it alongside the crew, which was not something a man of his means was required to do, and which he did anyway, because some things he needed to do himself. She understood that. There is something people sometimes say about wealth, that it solves problems. And it does, some of them. Wyatt Sterling's money had kept the ranch afloat through the months before Mara arrived, had funded the repairs and the salt and the timber and the correspondence and everything it took to build from nothing. Money matters. Anyone who says otherwise has not tried to do anything real without it. But what Mara had come to understand, in the months she'd spent on that ranch, and what she'd watched Wyatt come to understand, more slowly, in the way that people come to understand things that require them to revise a long-held certainty, was that money solved the problems that money could solve, which was a smaller set than most wealthy people believed. Couldn't make a ruined smokehouse run. It couldn't earn the trust of a skeptical crew. It couldn't make a 17-year-old boy into a person who could be relied on that was the boy's own doing, with someone willing to teach him correctly. Couldn't produce a contract with HL. Garrett or Vernon Chast or Edmund Farr, those contracts came from product that was real and work that was honest, and a woman who wrote letters in her own name and stood in a smokehouse and cut a sample and handed it across without a speech. Couldn't preserve what a family built. In the end, When the preservation required someone to look clearly at what was wrong and name it plainly, and then do the unglamorous, patient dailiness of fixing it. Those things required something else. Something that didn't have a price on it, but that anyone who'd ever tried to build something real would recognize immediately. The way you recognize a sound you've heard before without being able to name it until it's right in front of you. It was the willingness to show up and do the thing and not require it to be easy. It was the particular courage of practical people, not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind. The kind that looks like stubbornness from the outside and feels like necessity from the inside. The kind that gets up at 5:30 and checks the firebox and writes the letter and teaches the crew and does the numbers and goes back the next day and does it again. Mara Bellamy had arrived on the Sterling Ranch with a trunk, a canvas bag, and 30 days she'd negotiated for herself. She'd arrived thinking she was making a rational decision about risk. What she'd actually been doing was choosing, without fully knowing it yet, the place where she was going to build the rest of her life. It wasn't perfect. No life built out of real things ever was. There were difficult months and disagreements that required patience and operations that went sideways before they went right. There were nights when the weight of running something real sat on her chest the way heavy things do, and she lay awake going through numbers that, for once, were not the ranch's numbers, but her own, the private arithmetic of whether she was making the right decisions, building the right way, teaching the right things, loving the right person in the right ways. She usually concluded yes, not with certainty, because certainty was what you had before you'd tried anything, and therefore not to be trusted, but with the quieter confidence of someone who looked at what was there, the work, the people, the ongoing daily proof of things built and held and found it honest. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. The Smokehouse never stopped running. Season after season, Chimney put up its clean line into the Montana sky. Anyone coming up the road toward the Sterling Ranch could see it from a long way off, steady, purposeful, the mark of a place where someone had looked at what was broken and decided it was worth fixing. Some things, it turns out, are exactly worth what they cost you.